Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
Mastery in lying. Queen Rhaella leaned back slowly in her chair, her pale fingers resting against the carved armrest as her tired violet eyes studied him with renewed attention. The candlelight flickered across her face, softening the bruises and shadows beneath her eyes, yet it could not hide the sharp intelligence behind her gaze. For a few seconds, she remained silent, as though considering how to deal with the man seated near her. Then, in a calm voice that carried quiet authority despite its feminine softness, she spoke. "So what was the deal between you and Rhaegar, Merlin? And when did you meet him?" Merlin exhaled lightly through his nose. He had expected this question eventually. He adjusted his posture slightly, leaning back in the chair as though preparing his thoughts carefully. "Well, Your Grace," he began carefully, "I encountered Prince Rhaegar a few months ago while he was traveling. During our talks, he mentioned hearing rumors about a sorcerer living near where I stayed, and apparently he had been searching for me." His tone remained calm and measured. "I had helped a number of people in the area, and those who witnessed my abilities likely spread word of them. I believe that is how the prince learned about me. He was cautious around me at first, but after spending a few days visiting my home, we gradually came to know each other better." He paused briefly, watching their reactions for any sign of doubt, though the queen's soft expression revealed almost nothing before he continued his lies. "During that encounter, he saw what I was capable of, and my abilities intrigued the prince greatly. He asked many questions, like a scholar discovering knowledge long forgotten." Esser Ormond's eyes narrowed at that word, but he said nothing yet. Merlin continued weaving the story of his imaginary encounter with Rhaegar while ignoring the knight's suspicious stare. "And after that, he requested my assistance. Not as a knight or soldier to fight in his battles, but specifically to aid him with matters concerning his family." The room remained silent after his words, silently granting him permission to continue. Even Esser Willem Derry, standing quietly behind, seemed more focused now. Merlin spread his hands slightly. "That was the agreement, and now I am here because of it." A faint pause followed, then Merlin spoke more quietly. "I cannot tell you the full truth of that agreement. It was made between me and the prince." He met the queen's gaze directly. "However, if her grace truly wishes to know everything, I can explain it." A brief silence followed his words. Then he tilted his head slightly and added something that changed the atmosphere instantly. "But we would need to be alone in this chamber, just you and me, because I do not think I can trust anyone here. Even Your Grace, I trust only because you are his mother." For a moment, no one reacted, as if the meaning had not fully sunk in. Then Esser Ormond's face darkened instantly. "What did you just say?" His voice rose sharply. "How dare you speak such insolence in front of the queen? You impudent low-born wretch, I will have your tongue for that remark." Merlin slowly turned his head toward him. Merlin did not fully understand what had provoked the man's anger. Was it a taboo to request a private conversation with the queen, or were they afraid he might harm her if they were alone? Whatever the reason, he was beginning to grow tired of the man's attitude and the arrogance from him. His patience, already thin, finally snapped. Slowly, Merlin reached forward and closed his fingers around his wand. He lifted it with a calmness that didn't reach his eyes. "Glacius." His voice came out warm, almost gentle, yet it carried an unmistakable chill. In an instant, frost exploded from the wand's tip. It surged across the painted table in a glittering wave, swallowing the detailed map of Westeros. Rivers, mountains, and the names of the 7 kingdoms vanished beneath a rapidly spreading sheet of ice. The stone crackled with a thin, chilling sound as the frost claimed it. However, before he could respond, the situation shifted. A blade flashed into view. Cold steel kissed his throat. Esser Willem Derry stood directly behind him now, sword drawn, his voice low and laced with threat. "Don't move, lad," the old knight said quietly, "or I will slit your throat before you even blink." Esser Ormond looked pale now, his earlier anger replaced with unease as he stared at the frozen table. For a single moment, Merlin went still. It was not fear that held him but calculation. The blade at his throat was irrelevant. His attention locked onto Queen Rhaella. She had leaned away from the table, partially shielded by her lady-in-waiting. She did not panic. Instead, her eyes widened in disbelief at the ice-covered table. As she saw it, the proof stood before her, visible and undeniable, proof of his power. Merlin understood he needed to demonstrate his power to the queen, to prove he was truly capable. Esser Ormond had given him the perfect opportunity to show he was no fraud, but a dependable ally if she ever sought his allegiance. The demonstration had worked. It had earned him respect, added weight to his words, and even a touch of fear. Merlin exhaled slowly before turning toward the queen. Then, in a calm and controlled voice, he said, "I apologize, Your Grace. It seems I lost my composure after being insulted." The queen did not answer immediately. Then, finally, she spoke. "Leave us." The words were simple, but the room reacted instantly. Esser Willem frowned slightly. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, but I will take him away for questioning." "I said leave us." Her voice sharpened. This time, it carried command rather than request. An uncomfortable silence settled once more. Esser Ormond immediately objected. "But Your Grace, this man is dangerous. You cannot be left alone with him after what he just did." His eyes flicked toward the frozen table. "And his nature is still unknown why." Before he could continue, the Queen's lady-in-waiting finally spoke for the first time. Her voice was calm but firm. "Gentlemen, Her Grace wishes to speak privately. Please leave this chamber." There was something final in her tone. Something that carried authority even without rank. Esser Willem hesitated for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Merlin. Then slowly, he lowered his sword. But he did not sheath it fully. "I will be right outside the doors, Your Grace," he said quietly. Esser Ormond looked reluctant, but after a moment of tension, he bowed stiffly. "As you command." Both knights turned and left the chamber. The heavy doors closed behind them with a dull sound that echoed through the room. Now only three remained: Queen Rhaella, her lady-in-waiting, and Merlin. Rhaella studied Merlin for a long moment, then spoke softly. "She is Serena Velaryon," she said, gesturing slightly toward the woman beside her. "My lady-in-waiting. I trust her completely. You don't need to fear speaking in her presence." Serena gave a small nod, her expression unreadable as she looked at Merlin. Merlin simply observed her in return. Then the queen leaned forward slightly. "Now," she said quietly, "tell me the truth. What was the deal between you and my son? And how did Rhaegar come to trust you?" Her gaze sharpened. "And do not insult me with lies about your origin again." A faint pause followed, then her voice lowered, just slightly. "Before I asked you something in High Valyrian." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You did not understand a single word of it." The accusation was subtle but clear. "If you were truly connected to old Valyria as you claimed, you would have understood it." Her voice softened, but it carried something heavier now. "Do not lie to a grieving mother." Merlin felt a slight embarrassment at her tone, knowing he had taken advantage of the situation for his own reasons. Still, he told himself it had not been harmful, since he had helped her in the end. The woman before him remained complex and unfamiliar. He knew little of her beyond her reputation and a difficult past that had clearly left its mark. She seemed broken in many ways, and yet she was still a Targaryen, a queen who had ruled for many years. He looked at her quietly. Inside his mind, one thought emerged clearly. She had tested his words, and he had failed to support them by not knowing the Valyrian language. Yet he could not help but wonder why she did not think he might have simply forgotten it or never had the chance to learn. It hardly mattered now. For a brief moment, he even considered telling another lie. But then he realized something else. If he kept stacking lies, eventually everything would collapse. So instead, he made a different decision. He sighed internally. Without expression, he opened his system shop. He hesitated for only a second, then selected an option from the shop. Ding! Host used 200 fate points to purchase High Valyrian language. He paused and took a slow breath, steeling himself. A heartbeat later, knowledge surged into his mind. Words, grammar, sentence structures, pronunciation, all of it pouring in at once. It felt as though the language had always been a part of him. Merlin blinked once as he composed himself, then looked at Queen Rhaella and spoke fluently. Nike daer gimmigan ia mir nua lentot. Se nua daria hen exio edruta zaldrazoti isa. The effect was immediate. Queen Rhaella's eyes widened slightly. For the second time since the meeting began, she looked genuinely surprised. Serena Velaryon shifted slightly beside her, clearly recognizing the language even if she did not fully understand it. The queen stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she asked, "So you do know it?" Merlin shrugged slightly. "And yet you did not answer me when I asked earlier," she added, but her tone was sharper now. Merlin remained calm. "I was not expecting a language test, Your Grace." That answer made something flicker across her expression, something almost amused. It vanished just as quickly. Then her voice turned serious again. "So tell me," she said, "what exactly was this agreement between you and my son?" Merlin exhaled slowly. "Dragons," he said simply. The word hung in the air. Both women stared at him. Queen Rhaella leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Merlin continued, meeting her violet eyes. "I asked for dragon eggs, and Rhaegar agreed to help me hatch them." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Serena's expression changed slightly to disbelief. Queen Rhaella's voice came out slower now. "You wanted to hatch dragon eggs?" Merlin nodded. "Yes. And my son agreed to help you do this?" "Yes." A long silence followed again. Then the queen slowly shook her head. "That is impossible." Her voice dropped slightly. "Many of my ancestors tried. Many died trying. It is not something that can be done so easily." Merlin met her gaze. "I know that, Your Grace, but giving up is not enough." The prince was far more enthusiastic, firmly believing that either he or his children would hatch the dragon eggs. "Our deal was that, whether he won or lost against the rebels, I would protect his family." He was planning something I did not know, but it was tied to the fate of the realm. Then added calmly, "And I intend to uphold my promise. I promised him I would save his family in return, even though he is no longer with us." The queen studied him carefully again, trying to understand his words about her son. She had not been close to him in recent times, their bond unlike that of a typical mother and son, as much of her life had been spent away from him or in separation. Before she could speak again, the door to the chamber suddenly opened. The interruption broke the tension instantly. Queen Rhaella's expression tightened. "What is it?" she asked sharply. Sir Willem Darry stepped inside quickly. His face was serious. "I am sorry for interrupting, Your Grace," he said. "But it is urgent." 8 comments 0 vote. A not so good news. Inside the meeting chamber, Merlin immediately noticed the change in Queen Rhaella's expression the moment Sir Willem Darry mentioned the matter was urgent. Exhaustion still lingered upon her face, yet now a deep seriousness had settled over her features as well. The war had torn her kingdom apart piece by piece, and every raven that arrived carried news of further ruin. She slowly nodded to the old knight before lifting her gaze to his. Her purple eyes were weary, though dignity still lingered within them. "Then speak." Willem Darry did not speak. He stepped aside and opened the chamber doors wider as an elderly man dressed in dark gray robes entered the chamber. Chains of silver and iron hung around his neck, clinking softly with every careful step across the room. His face was deeply marked by age, though his posture still carried strength and steadiness. The maester bowed respectfully. "Your Grace." Queen Rhaella inclined her head slightly. "Tell me, Maester Halvorn, what news has arrived?" The old man hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "I fear it is not favorable news." A faint bitter smile appeared on the queen's lips. "I have not received favorable news in many months. Speak plainly." The maester inhaled slowly before unfolding the parchment in his hands. "A raven arrived from the Reach shortly before dawn. Highgarden has surrendered to the rebels." The chamber became utterly still. Even the crackling of the torches seemed to fade beneath the weight of the terrible news that had just been spoken. Merlin watched the queen carefully as the words settled upon her shoulders like another unbearable weight. Maester Halvorn continued carefully. "The usurper has formally declared himself king with the support of House Lannister, House Arryn, House Stark, and House Tully. Ravens report that many lesser lords have already begun swearing fealty to him." At those words, Queen Rhaella lowered her gaze toward the stone table. Her fingers tightened slightly against the armrest. "So the Kinslayer has finally reached his ambition." Merlin understood immediately whom she meant. Robert Baratheon. Her father and Robert's grandmother had shared the blood of House Targaryen, and no matter how distant the relation had become, the queen still considered him kin. And now that kin had destroyed her house. The maester cleared his throat before reading directly from the parchment. "Lord Mace Tyrell has concluded that continued hostilities in the Reach are no longer sustainable. Highgarden seeks terms with the victorious claimant, Robert Baratheon, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men." Silence followed. Queen Rhaella stared at the cold black stone table beneath her hands for several long moments before finally speaking. "So the Reach withdraws its armies and abandons House Targaryen." Her voice remained calm, though the bitterness beneath it was unmistakable. Sir Ormond finally spoke. "Well, Your Grace, it was inevitable." Merlin immediately noticed the difference in the man's tone. There was no outrage in it, no anger toward the Tyrells, only quiet resignation. Sir Willem immediately frowned at him. Ormond continued regardless. King's Landing has fallen. The royal armies are shattered. Prince Rhaegar is dead. There is no throne left to defend. His words echoed harshly through the chamber. We have Dragonstone and barely 300 loyal men remaining. No nearby lords answer our ravens. No fleets come to our aid. The realm has already chosen its victor already. Sir Willem looked at him coldly, clearly displeased by his bluntness before the queen. Merlin merely observed quietly. The man already sounded prepared to kneel before Robert. Maester Halvorn continued reading. The rebel administration has begun consolidating power throughout the realm. Ravens are being sent to every major house demanding submission to King Robert. With 4 great houses supporting his claim, many others are expected to yield soon. Queen Rhaella closed her eyes. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Merlin could see the subtle glare shared between Sir Ormond and Sir Willem, as though the two men were at war with one another, only their eyes serving as weapons instead of swords. The only sound inside the chamber came from the distant crashing waves beyond Dragonstone's walls. Then finally, the queen opened her eyes again and spoke with unmistakable conviction in her voice. Prepare a coronation ceremony. Everyone looked toward her with surprise. Tomorrow Viserys shall be crowned king of the 7 kingdoms. Even Merlin raised an eyebrow at her outrageous claim, while the maester blinked in disbelief as if he could not comprehend what the queen had just said. A king without throne or realm, not even present in the kingdom, yet she spoke of crowning him. Merlin could only imagine what confusion must have been running through the maester's mind. Rhaella's voice hardened. Send ravens to every lord in Westeros. They will be reminded where true loyalty belongs. House Targaryen will not appear weak before the realm. Maester Halvorn immediately looked troubled. Your Grace, according to the laws of succession, the throne belongs to Prince Aegon, son of Crown Prince Rhaegar. Sir Ormond interrupted instantly. But Prince Aegon is still a newborn, he argued. The realm requires a ruler old enough to bear the weight of a crown. Prince Viserys is the wiser choice. The maester frowned. Even so, ignoring succession traditions may create distrust among those still loyal to House Targaryen. Queen Rhaella shook her head slowly. The king made this decision after Rhaegar died in battle, though it was never publicly announced. Still, Viserys remains his chosen heir. Another silence followed. The tension in the chamber deepened further as the queen revealed the hidden truth. Merlin studied the faces in the chamber. Maester Halvorn looked dissatisfied, Sir Ormond appeared pleased for reasons unknown, and Sir Willem remained completely expressionless. Finally, Merlin spoke. Well, Your Grace, I believe that would be a very unwise decision. Every gaze in the chamber turned toward him instantly. Queen Rhaella raised an eyebrow slightly. But before she could respond, Sir Ormond sneered openly. Do not interfere in matters beyond your understanding, sorcerer. The word immediately caught Maester Halvorn's attention. The old man stared at Merlin with confusion and curiosity, and it was clear he now had questions about whether he truly was a sorcerer. However, Queen Rhaella ignored Ormond's hostility. And why? She asked calmly, do you believe it is unwise? Merlin leaned back slightly in his chair. Because crowning Prince Viserys now creates dangerous circumstances for House Targaryen. The queen studied him carefully. What kind of circumstances? Merlin answered calmly. You risk losing Dorne. The room quieted further. Merlin continued. Prince Aegon's mother is Elia Martell. His blood ties House Martell directly to the line of succession. If Prince Viserys is crowned over him, Dorne may see it as an insult to their blood and position. And they will never fight for Prince Viserys the way they would fight for Prince Aegon. Sir Willem slowly nodded. Merlin continued. At best, they may simply abandon the war entirely and negotiate with Robert Baratheon. At worst, they may believe House Targaryen betrayed them. That possibility visibly disturbed several people present. Queen Rhaella's expression darkened. And if that happens, then the last meaningful ally remaining to your family disappears. Merlin folded his hands together calmly. The Reach has surrendered. The Crownlands are shattered. The Westerlands support Robert. The North follows Stark. The Vale follows Arryn. The Riverlands follow Tully. He looked directly at the queen. Dorne is the only great kingdom that still possesses reason to support House Targaryen. Sir Willem spoke next. I agree with him, Your Grace. Sir Ormond immediately looked irritated. Sir Willem continued calmly. Even during the war, Dorne acted cautiously. They sent forces because Princess Elia and her children were tied to the crown, not because they desired conquest or help. He paused briefly. Lord Doran Martell is not a man eager for war. Merlin nodded. But he may fight for his blood. He looked toward the queen again. If Prince Aegon remains heir, Dorne still has reason to remain loyal. If Prince Viserys becomes king, they gain nothing from continuing the struggle. Esser Ormond scoffed. So we are to place the fate of the realm upon a babe in swaddling cloth. He turned toward the queen. Prince Viserys is older. He is capable of being presented before the realm. More importantly, his voice sharpened slightly, he is pure Targaryen. Merlin's eyes narrowed faintly. There is no realm left to rule, Esser Ormond. The words struck the chamber heavily. The realm has already turned against House Targaryen. Ormond glared at him. Merlin continued calmly as he looked at the queen. With respect, Your Grace, Dragonstone is all that remains. 300 loyal soldiers and a handful of retainers. His gaze remained steady. If you destroy your alliance with Dorne as well, then crowning Prince Viserys gains you nothing. Queen Rhaella remained silent, clearly thinking deeply now. Finally she asked quietly, then what would you suggest? Merlin answered without hesitation, postpone the coronation. Esser Ormond immediately objected, that would appear as surrender. Merlin ignored him, Prince Viserys is still young. Allow time to pass, watch how the realm develops. Let the princes grow, he is still a child. Let him train, let him learn politics, war, leadership, and swordsmanship. Let loyalties settle. He paused briefly. At this moment House Targaryen lacks the strength to enforce any claim regardless of which prince wears the crown. That silence returned once more. The queen closed her eyes briefly before exhaling softly. Very well. Esser Ormond's expression immediately darkened. The coronation will be postponed for now. We will wait and observe Dorne's response before deciding further. Merlin noticed the visible frustration on Ormond's face while Esser Willem seemed quietly relieved. Queen Rhaella slowly rose from her chair. That is enough for today. Her voice sounded tired once more. I wish to visit Elia. Esser Willem bowed respectfully before departing. Esser Ormond followed shortly afterward, though not before throwing one final glare toward Merlin. Merlin responded with a faint amused smirk which only worsened the knight's mood. Maester Halvorn also bowed and exited quietly. Soon the chamber became nearly empty. Only Queen Rhaella, her lady-in-waiting and Merlin remained. The queen turned slightly toward him, noticing he had not moved. Is there something else, Merlin? He rose slowly from his chair. Yes, Your Grace, I have a request. Her eyebrow lifted slightly with intrigue. What is it? Merlin smiled faintly. It is nothing major. I simply request permission to travel south to Dorne. If possible, I would also require a ship. The queen looked surprised. You are leaving Dragonstone? Merlin shook his head. No, I intend to return. Then why go to Dorne? Merlin's expression became thoughtful. I intend to bring help back with me. That immediately gained her attention. Help, yes. The queen frowned slightly. Do you mean House Martell? Merlin shook his head again. No, this concerns Prince Rhaegar. The moment he mentioned her son, Queen Rhaella's full attention focused upon him. Merlin continued. Before his death, Prince Rhaegar informed me that several of his Kingsguard remained in the south. The queen looked visibly surprised. The Kingsguard? Merlin nodded. I wish to locate them and bring them here if possible. Queen Rhaella stared at him carefully. Why not simply send ravens summoning them? Merlin sighed softly. I believe they are somewhere ravens cannot easily reach. His mind briefly drifted toward a lonely tower hidden among the red mountains of Dorne. The Tower of Joy, he continued calmly, and personally speaking, it may be better if I go myself. Queen Rhaella's gaze sharpened slightly. What important mission could justify their absence from their prince's side, when they were sworn to fight and protect him? Merlin hesitated deliberately. That, Your Grace, I don't know fully. He knew enough. Enough to understand what waited in Dorne. Enough to understand how dangerous it would become once Eddard Stark arrived there. Enough to know Lyanna Stark was still alive. For now at least. Merlin continued carefully. Prince Rhaegar trusted those men greatly. If they still live and remain loyal, their presence here would strengthen Dragonstone considerably. The queen slowly nodded. Yes, Merlin continued. Especially for the protection of yourself, Princess Elia, and the children. Queen Rhaella studied him for several long seconds before finally speaking. I will write letters authorizing you to speak in my name. Merlin inclined his head respectfully. Thank you, Your Grace. I will also instruct Esser Willem to provide you with whatever ship and supplies you require. Merlin nodded again. I appreciate it. The queen stepped closer slightly. When do you intend to leave? As soon as possible. He glanced briefly toward the darkened windows where storm clouds gathered over the sea. Tonight, if preparations can be completed quickly. Queen Rhaella seemed surprised by the urgency in his voice, though she did not question it. Very well. Then finally she nodded again before turning toward Serena Velaryon. Come, we will prepare the letters. The queen said nothing further before exiting the chamber alongside her lady-in-waiting. Soon Merlin stood alone beside the great painted table of Westeros. The thin layer of ice covering part of its surface slowly melted away from the remnants of his earlier spell. Droplets slid across rivers and mountains carved into the wood. Merlin stared silently at the southern region of the map. Dorne. His expression slowly lost its calm amusement. Because this journey was not merely about bringing back Kingsguard. No, there were other reasons, other people who needed saving before history consumed them. He had delayed for 2 days already because of Dragonstone's chaos and uncertainty. Every wasted hour increased the danger. If he arrived too late, his fingers lightly tapped against the cold table. Ned Stark would eventually reach the tower. And when he did, blood would follow. 11 comments 0 vote. Young Prince. Outside of Dragonstone Fortress. The wind screamed across the black cliffs like living creatures, carrying the sharp taste of salt and the distant thunder of waves striking the fortress below. The long stone staircase descending from the fortress stretched toward the harbor like a carved spine, each ancient step worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, heavy storms, and relentless sea winds. Merlin stood near one of the cliff edges above the harbor, his cloak shifting slightly in the gusts. From here, he could see the full spread of Dragonstone's lower coast. Below, the harbor was already alive with activity. Ships moved constantly around the island, their dark sails slicing through the gray sea. Targaryen vessels patrolled slowly around Dragonstone like vigilant sea guardians, their crews watching for any sign of invasion. Even now, with the war seemingly won by the usurper, the fortress remained tense and watchful. Merlin's gaze lingered across the scene. Despite its bleakness, Dragonstone had a strange beauty to it. The black stone architecture rising from the volcanic rock. The winding stairs that connected fortress to sea like veins. The ever-present mist that softened the edges of everything it touched. Merlin inhaled deeply, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Today was the day of his departure. His ship was being prepared, and within a few hours he would sail south toward Dorne. He had expected a quiet wait, a moment of reflection on his plans before travel, but Dragonstone rarely allowed silence to remain undisturbed. A voice broke through the wind. So you are that sorcerer. The tone was sharp, childish, and carried a hint of arrogance that did not belong in such a young voice. Merlin slowly turned toward the owner of the voice. A boy stood several steps ahead of him on the stone stairway. He was small, no more than 6 or 7 years of age, yet carried himself with a stiffness that suggested early training in pride rather than humility. Long silver hair whipped around his face in the wind, and his eyes, a deep shade of violet, stared upward with unmistakable dissatisfaction. Merlin instantly recognized who the boy was. There was only one child on Dragonstone with such striking features, Viserys Targaryen. The future beggar king of Essos, or at least that was the cruel fate waiting for him. Merlin observed the boy. Even at that age, there was something unmistakably Targaryen about him. The features were delicate yet sharp, the expression already shaped by expectations far too heavy for a child. He looked like someone trying to stand taller than his own body allowed. Merlin regarded him calmly. As far as I know, there is only one sorcerer in Dragonstone. So yes, that would be me. He tilted his head slightly. And you must be Prince Viserys. The boy frowned immediately and declared with unwavering confidence, yes. And the future king of the 7 kingdoms. Merlin raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. The boy stepped closer, carefully balancing against the wind that threatened to push him sideways. His frown deepened as though the effort of standing still was beneath him. Why did you not bow to me, sorcerer? The boy demanded sharply. Do you not recognize or respect royalty? You could be punished for such disrespect. Merlin blinked once. For a brief moment, the absurdity of the situation nearly drew a laugh from him. A child who still wet his bed stood before him, speaking threats like a king already seated upon the Iron Throne. Still, Merlin restrained himself from making fun of him. He lowered his head slightly in a controlled, respectful bow. My apologies, Your Grace. I did not mean to offend you. I was distracted by the heavy wind and the view. Viserys seemed satisfied by this. That is better. You should remember your place. Merlin almost smiled at that, though he kept his expression composed. What brings you out here, your grace? The boy narrowed his eyes. I heard you were behind what happened yesterday. You tried to prevent my crowning ceremony that should have taken place today. Merlin raised his eyebrows in genuine surprise. He had not expected the boy to learn such information so quickly. Who told you that, Esser Ormond? The boy said immediately. He said you convinced my mother to delay the ceremony. He said you support Aegon instead of me as king. The name Aegon carried weight in Viserys's voice, a mixture of resentment and frustration, clearly planted by repeated influence from those around him. His tone darkened slightly. I will have you know I am perfectly fit to be king. My father named me heir before we sailed to Dragonstone. He lifted his chin proudly. I am the rightful king. Merlin studied him carefully. The boy was clearly repeating what he had been told, not only by Esser Ormond but likely by others as well. Adults were shaping his identity and beliefs into something they could use, bending his trust until it belonged to them alone, tightening their grip on the future king. Then Viserys added, almost casually, I am far better suited than that half-breed boy Aegon. Merlin's expression cooled instantly as he said in a calm voice, careful, prince. Viserys frowned and said, what, you are speaking about your nephew? Merlin replied calmly. And your brother's children. The boy hesitated upon hearing Merlin's words, but his expression soon changed slightly as he said, but Esser Ormond said I am the trueborn one, a pure Targaryen. He said Rhaenys and Aegon are not truly our blood. There it was. Merlin's eyes narrowed slightly. Esser Ormond was not just ambitious. He was shaping the boy, planting division in a young and uninformed mind, trying to turn blood against blood. Merlin exhaled slowly as he lowered himself slightly so he could meet the boy's eyes. Prince Viserys, he said, let me ask you something. Your great-grandfather, King Aegon V, married Betha Blackwood. Viserys frowned, processing Merlin's words slowly. That cannot be. It is history, Merlin said gently. She was not a Targaryen, he continued. So by that logic, does that make your father half-breed as well? The boy froze as his young mind struggled visibly with the thought. Merlin continued calmly, and many Targaryens who were kings married those who were not of their blood. Or are you suggesting your own royal line is impure? Viserys' eyes widened slightly. I didn't mean that. Then perhaps Esser Ormond is not entirely correct, Merlin said gently. The boy looked unsettled for the first time, as though the foundations beneath his certainty had shifted slightly. Merlin watched the boy carefully. After a moment, Viserys looked up again, uncertainty creeping into his voice. So he is really wrong. People can be wrong, Merlin said. The boy hesitated again, uncertain whether to speak, before finally saying in a confused voice, what about my father then? He said Rhaenys wasn't trueborn. Merlin sighed internally. This was where it became dangerous. The boy had likely witnessed his father insulting Elia and her children and concluded his father was right simply because he was king. So he softened his tone. Your father was a king, he said carefully. And kings carry heavy burdens. Sometimes they say things in anger or frustration that they do not fully mean. The boy tilted his head. So, he was just angry. He said with a bitter laugh. Ha, so that's why he slapped mother many times, because he was under a lot of pressure ruling the realm. Merlin paused as he saw the boy's expression shift, as though he had just realized his father's actions toward his mother. Merlin immediately understood he needed to correct this carefully. He did not want to give the boy the impression that pressure could justify abuse. He did not want to raise a prince who would think harming women was acceptable simply because he was frustrated or upset. So he immediately said, not everything your father did was right, Prince Viserys. Some things were mistakes, a really bad mistake. He saw the boy look startled, as if his worldview had shifted once again. Merlin could not simply tell him that his father had been crazy, or fucked in the head, as that would be an insult to the boy and could be seen as mocking the dead king. How can a king make mistakes? Said the boy. All men do, Merlin said simply. Kings are not exceptions. Viserys looked down at the stone steps, thinking. The wind tugged at his hair, and for a moment he seemed less like a prince and more like a child standing at the edge of understanding something far too large. Then he muttered, so Esser Ormond is wrong too. Merlin nodded slightly. Oh yes, he definitely is. Then the boy looked up again. So who should I believe? Merlin softened his tone. Your family. Always your family. Your mother and your brother's children are all your family. You must always prioritize them, because you are among the last of the Targaryens. As their prince, you must protect them. Otherwise, House Targaryen will not survive if you turn against your own blood. That answer seemed to settle something within the boy. The boy slowly nodded in understanding. And Merlin continued, and to do that, you must study hard, learn to wield a sword, and master any other skills a prince is expected to learn, as the boy looked at him thoughtfully. Merlin cringed inwardly, thinking, damn, since when did I start acting like an old grandpa, disciplining children and guiding them toward righteousness? Then the boy said with a bright expression, yes, you speak exactly what I always thought, sorcerer. If I do what a prince must do, I will be a powerful king like Aegon Targaryen. I will raise an army, he said proudly. And I will take back the 7 kingdoms. Merlin was speechless for a moment before a faint smile touched his face. That is a very big goal. I will punish the traitors too, Viserys added quickly. Merlin's smile faded slightly. Let's focus on learning first. The boy frowned at his words. Learning, yes, Merlin said, swordsmanship, history, languages, discipline. Viserys groaned. I don't want to learn languages. You will need them, Merlin replied. The boy sighed dramatically, but High Valyrian is difficult to learn. Merlin chuckled softly. That is because it is supposed to be so. It is one of the traits of a Targaryen to know High Valyrian, a language spoken to dragons. Do you truly not wish to learn such an important language that represents your origin? Viserys looked up again and said in a defeated tone, do true Targaryens really have to learn it? Yes, Merlin said without hesitation. The boy seemed to accept this. And then can I speak with dragons too? He asked suddenly, his eyes lighting up. Merlin's expression softened slightly. Yes, he said quietly. If you find one alive, then yes you can. Viserys smiled proudly, but before he could say anything else, footsteps approached rapidly from behind. Your Grace. 2 armored knights appeared at the edge of the path, whined struggling against their cloaks. You are not supposed to be out here again, one of them said firmly. Her Grace is looking for you and is displeased that you snuck out. Viserys immediately straightened. I wasn't sneaking, he said quickly. You just didn't see me. Both knights exchanged tired looks. Merlin suppressed a smile. Come on, Prince, he said gently. Go back inside, it is not safe out here. Viserys hesitated briefly before he looked at Merlin one last time. I will be king, he said firmly. Merlin nodded. Yes, then added in a softer tone, if you learn properly. The boy seemed satisfied with that answer and was guided back up the stairs, his silver hair disappearing gradually into the storm as the knights escorted him toward the fortress. Even as he left, there was still something defiant in his posture, as though the conversation had not ended so much as been paused. Merlin remained where he stood for a moment longer. He hoped the boy could be different from what he knew of him in his previous life, wiser, smarter, more useful. He wondered if the system would grant him fate points for shaping him into something better than he was meant to be. He hoped it would. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts again. Merlin turned to see Sir Willem approaching and stopping before him. The older knight stood firm against the wind, his armor darkened by travel and salt air. Behind him, another man waited quietly, dressed in light travel armor and carrying the calm presence of a seasoned knight. Sir William gestured toward the unknown knight. This is Dorian Sand of Dorne. He will accompany you in this journey since you said you are not familiar with that land, so I decided that send him with you as a guide. Merlin thought it was convenient, but he knew the older knight was simply sending the man to keep watch over him. Still, he inclined his head politely toward Dorian. A pleasure. The Dornish knight returned a respectful nod, his expression unreadable but not hostile. The ship is ready, the old knight said, gesturing for him to follow. Together, they began descending the long stone stairs, the wind pressing against them as they moved. Sir Willem's voice came as he descended. Yesterday, he said slowly, you gave the queen good counsel. Merlin shrugged and glanced at him briefly. She was under pressure, and I merely offered a perspective. That perspective delayed a royal decision and saved her grace from possible complications and regrets, said the older knight. Merlin gave a faint smile. Then perhaps it was a necessary delay. The knight did not respond, remaining silent as they continued downward. Eventually, he spoke again in a lower tone. I am a follower of the faith of the 7. My teachings tell me that sorcery is dangerous. That those who practice it often deceive and harm. Merlin listened without interruption. If I had my way, the knight continued, you would not remain here for a second. But Princess Elia speaks in your favor. The queen trusts her judgment. That is the only reason you are allowed to remain here or travel freely. His gaze sharpened. So I will allow you to go to Dorne and return to Dragonstone. The knight's hand rested lightly near his sword. But understand this, if you show even the slightest threat to the royal family, I will not hesitate. Merlin rolled his eyes slightly but still said, understood, Sir Knight. He gave a small shrug. That seemed reasonable. The Dornish knight behind them said nothing, but his attention remained steady, observing quietly. Eventually, the stairs leveled out and the port came into full view. The ship waiting there was modest in design, stripped of any royal markings. Its sails were plain, built for speed and discretion rather than display. Sir Willem gestured toward it. Your traveling vessel. Merlin stepped forward, studying it. It looked efficient and discreet enough not to be recognized as a Targaryen ship, making it very suitable for this trip. Sir William gave a final nod. Safe travels. Merlin inclined his head in appreciation. Thanks. The knight hesitated, then added stiffly. May the Seven watch over your journey. Merlin smiled faintly. Oh, I don't think your gods will watch over a sorcerer they despise. But it's not as if they can descend from wherever they are to strike me down. Still, I would prefer it that your gods be generous. The remark earned him a flat stare. He sighed. Right, humor is not universally appreciated. Or maybe I am not very well versed in humor. Without further delay, Merlin stepped onto the ship. Behind him, the Dornish knight followed, and the vessel prepared to depart. As the sails caught the wind and Dragonstone began to fade into the distance, Merlin looked back once at the dark fortress rising above the sea. 12 comments 0 vote. Dorne. 2 weeks later. Dorne territory of House Manwëdy. Deep within the territory of House Manwëdy, hidden among the red mountains of Dorne, a lone rider traveled slowly through the unforgiving paths of the Prince's Pass. The gray horse carefully picked its way across loose shale and red stone, its hooves striking the rocky ground with dull clacks that echoed faintly between the narrow cliffs. Dry winds swept endlessly through the mountain gaps, carrying with them the scent of sun-scorched stone, dust, and wild thyme that stubbornly grew from cracks in the rock. This was not the Dorne most men imagined. There were no endless seas of golden dunes here. No blazing desert stretching beyond the horizon. The red mountains were cruel in another way. Jagged peaks rose like broken spears into the sky while steep cliffs and narrow paths twisted endlessly through the harsh terrain. The air was cooler here than the lowlands of Dorne, thinner as well, yet still dry enough to split lips and parch throats. The rider grimaced as the horse stepped over another uneven stretch of stone. Careful now, Merlin muttered under his breath while gently pulling the reins. The horse snorted in annoyance. Merlin himself looked almost Dornish now. A sand-colored scarf covered most of his face to shield him from dust and sunlight while loose robes and flowing desert tunics hung over his lean frame. A dark embroidered belt wrapped around his waist and long sleeves protected his skin from the merciless sun. Yet despite the exotic appearance, he looked utterly miserable, as though he had been thrown into a land whose harsh weather was never meant for him. After another painful hour of riding, Merlin finally pulled the reins and stopped the horse beside a cluster of weathered rocks. Oh, it seems the fucking seven gods of Sir Willem Darry are punishing me now for being a wizard. May I never be subjected to their pettiness. He slowly slid off the saddle and nearly collapsed the moment his boots touched the ground. My back is broken, he groaned while stretching painfully. My ass hurts so badly I can feel the damn bones. The horse looked at him blankly. Merlin pointed accusingly at the animal. I loathe horse riding, absolutely loathe it. The gray stallion snorted again. Yes, yes, easy for you to say, demon. The horse tossed its head proudly at the name. Merlin sighed deeply while removing the scarf from his face. Dry wind brushed against his skin as he stared at the endless mountain paths ahead. How am I supposed to survive in this world when every journey takes days of riding? He muttered bitterly. People in this world are built different. Demon merely chewed at a stubborn patch of grass growing between stones. Merlin narrowed his eyes at the horse. What do you think, demon? Are we close or not? The horse gave no answer beyond another snort. Merlin rubbed his aching back while memories of the past 2 weeks surfaced in his mind. The journey had been maddening from the very beginning. It had taken nearly 6 days just to reach Dorne. During the voyage he had questioned Dorian Sand repeatedly about the Tower of Joy, only to discover that the knight had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. At first Merlin assumed the man simply didn't know every forgotten tower in Dorne, which was reasonable enough. Then they had crossed the narrow sea and sailed into the Sea of Dorne before docking at Ghost Hill. There Merlin had begun asking questions. Unfortunately, asking Dornishmen about a tower had proven utterly useless. Dorne was full of towers. Watchtowers near the sea searched constantly for ships. Ruined towers had been destroyed by war or consumed by time. Abandoned towers had become dens for bandits and rogue soldiers. Guard towers belonged to the powerful houses of Dorne. Ancient towers, raised by the first men when they invaded Westeros through Dorne, had once been built from fear of the children of the forest watching them from the wilds. Most were later broken apart in the endless wars of men. In Dorne, every broken pile of stone apparently counted as a tower. Worse still, almost nobody recognized the name Tower of Joy. Merlin had cursed himself countless times for never paying attention to its exact location back in his previous life. At the time it had seemed like irrelevant information. Now he deeply regretted it. Thankfully, he had remembered one important detail: the Red Mountains and something about being near the Prince's Pass. That single memory had spared him from wandering blindly across half of Dorne. Though even then, the journey had hardly become any easier. Dorian sand had quickly become unbearable. The man spent most of the trip trying to convince Merlin to visit various pleasure houses. Apparently every town in Dorne had a brothel Dorian considered historically significant. Merlin had rejected him every single time. Eventually they sailed farther west and docked near lands belonging to House Will before beginning the climb toward the Red Mountains. Then came the final irritation for Merlin. One night while camping, Dorian casually announced he was going to relieve himself. And the man who had wandered off to piss somewhere in the mountains never returned to the camp. Merlin spent hours searching the surrounding area, fearing the night had been attacked by mountain beasts or fallen into some hidden ravine. He found nothing. No corpse torn apart by beasts, no blood staining the rocks. He could not even find the man's horse that had supposedly been tied near Demon. It was as if both rider and horse had disappeared into thin air. Eventually Merlin concluded the bastard had abandoned him for wine and Dornish whores. Frankly, Merlin could not even blame him. During their journey, he had come to know the man somewhat. The knight had spent 6 years stationed on Dragonstone and often complained that he had not touched a single woman in all that time. Even the fortress servants avoided him, though he never explained why. The man was clearly burnt out and desperate for some kind of release. At least the knight had helped enough to point him toward the right region before disappearing. Merlin remembered the last useful conversation he had 2 days earlier with an old Dornish farmer. An old round tower, the man had said while spitting sideways. Near the top of the pass where the wind never stops. Nothing there now except bad memories and worse rumors. No one had called it the Tower of Joy. He later remembered that it had been Rhaegar himself who gave it that name. To the locals, it was simply the old tower or the watchtower. Some pretended not to know it at all. Others looked away too quickly when asked, which only made Merlin more certain he was close. He pulled himself back onto the saddle with effort. "Come on, demon," he sighed. "We have lives to save." The horse began moving once more through the winding mountain paths. Hours passed. The sun slowly descended westward, painting the mountains in shades of crimson and burnt gold. Long shadows stretched across the rocky terrain while black hawks circled high above the peaks. Then finally, Merlin climbed one last ridge and froze at what he saw in the distance. Far below, nestled beside a small, lonely pond among the mountains, stood a pale stone tower. Merlin slowly smiled. Well, he murmured. "Finally found you." His eyes remained fixed upon the tower. "What the fuck were you thinking, Rhaegar?" he muttered. "Keeping a pregnant girl in a place like this?" Without wasting another moment he nudged Demon forward. The horse descended carefully toward the tower as twilight approached. As Merlin drew closer, he noticed faint light glowing from narrow windows near the top. Relief spread through him immediately. He was not too late. Ned Stark had not arrived yet, which meant the girl was still alive. The closer he rode, the more nervous he became. Not from fear of death, for he was certain no one here could harm him. Rather, it was the thought of who waited inside, the Kingsguard, figures spoken of as legends in both books and show. Men whose names were spoken throughout Westeros with awe. As he got closer to the tower, movement caught his eye as the tower's door slowly opened and 3 armored figures emerged from within. Merlin instinctively slowed Demon near the edge of the pond while watching the knights approach. Even from a distance they were imposing. White cloaks shifted behind them in the wind while polished armor reflected the dying sunlight. The oldest among them walked at the front. He was tall with broad shoulders and a fit body. Given how old he was, it was magnificent to have such body comparable to young men even though it was covered by the armor, but still it was apparent, he had gray-haired which had turned that way because of passing of time. Beside him walked 2 younger knights. One moved with calm, deadly grace, a unique sword at his side that Merlin instantly recognized. The sword of the morning, Sir Arthur Dane. The last knight remained stern-faced and watchful, identified only as Sir Oswell Went. The 3 approached carefully, hands hovering near their sword hilts, ready for battle at any moment, their eyes full of suspicion as they looked him over. The elderly knight stood several feet away from Merlin. "Who are you, stranger?" the old knight asked coldly. "And what business brings you here?" Merlin remained atop his horse for a moment before smiling faintly. "You should be Sir Gerald Hightower," he said calmly. "The White Bull himself." The atmosphere shifted at once. Sir Arthur Dane's hand moved toward Dawn. Sir Oswell Went's gaze hardened, sharp with suspicion. Of course they became vigilant, because the man before them knew them and remained unnervingly relaxed for the circumstances. Even Gerald's eyes hardened. "Who sent you?" the Lord Commander asked quietly. "And how did you find this place?" Merlin sighed internally. Straight to suspicion. "Fair enough. My name is Merlin," he answered. "And I was sent here by Her Grace Queen Rhaella Targaryen." That earned him their immediate attention, now marked by curiosity rather than hostility or aggression. The Queen expects the Kingsguard to honor their vows and return to their duties protecting the royal blood. Sir Gerald Hightower frowned deeply. "And why," he asked, "should I trust the word of an unknown stranger in wartime?" Merlin slowly reached beneath his robes, instantly making all 3 knights tense. Sir Arthur Dane's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. Merlin resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He carefully produced a sealed letter. "It is a decree from Her Grace." He dismounted slowly before walking forward. Gerald accepted the letter cautiously. The old knight opened it and silently read the contents while the wind howled softly around them. After several moments his expression darkened further. "What does it say?" Sir Oswell asked. Gerald folded the parchment carefully. "The Queen commands us to return to Dragonstone." Sir Arthur Dane frowned immediately at his words. "We cannot," he said firmly. "We have our duty here." Sir Gerald looked toward Merlin again. "A letter proves little," he said. "For all I know, this could be a trap. So tell me, stranger, why should I believe you? The seal is royal, but it is easy to forge." Merlin exhaled slowly, holding back the urge to point out that a royal seal was not easily forged, and that knights who had spent their lives at court should be able to tell truth from imitation. He understood the older knight was playing with words. "Time for the harder part." "Well," he said casually, "Prince Rhaegar himself sent me." Silence followed his words. Absolute silence, save for the sounds of nature. All 3 Kingsguard stared at him. Then, after an uncomfortable pause, Sir Arthur Dane stepped forward slightly. "How?" he asked sharply. "How did the prince send you?" So Merlin told them what he had already told the Queen. Not everything, but enough for these 3 men, drunk on loyalty, to let their guard slip. He spoke of meeting Rhaegar before the Battle of the Trident, of the prince entrusting him with the protection of his family should the worst occur. He explained how King's Landing had fallen, how Aerys was dead, and how Rhaegar had fallen at the Trident. And finally how he had rescued Elia Martell along with Rhaenys and Aegon during the sack of King's Landing before taking them safely to Dragonstone. The effect of his words was immediate. Even the composed White Bull looked shaken. "Princess Elia lives?" Sir Gerald asked quietly. Merlin nodded. "So do the children. They are already playing in the halls of Dragonstone with their beloved Uncle Viserys." The old knight lowered his eyes briefly. "We heard they vanished during the sack," he murmured. "I feared the worst." "I took them from the city myself," Merlin replied. "They are safe on Dragonstone with the Queen and Prince Viserys, now protected by 300 men, Sir Willem Darry, and Sir Ormond." "Sir Willem Darry, you say?" Sir Gerald said, a thoughtful look crossing his face. A look of uncertainty spread among the Kingsguard. Then Oswell Went narrowed his eyes. "You expect us to believe Prince Rhaegar entrusted his family to a stranger?" he asked suspiciously. "I never once saw you beside the prince." "That makes 2 of us," Merlin muttered under his breath. "What? Nothing." Merlin shrugged casually. "I suppose you could say I was useful to the prince." Arthur Dane's blue eyes remained fixed upon him. "Who are you really?" Merlin smirked slightly. "A man who is standing by a promise he made to a certain prince, trying to stop this entire situation from becoming even worse." Then his tone shifted, growing serious. "The Queen needs you. Princess Elia needs you. Her children need you. Dragonstone is vulnerable, and the realm is in chaos. You 3 are among the finest knights alive, and the Targaryen army is leaderless now. They need loyal men to protect them so they remain alive on Dragonstone. Otherwise, the family will vanish. No one will remain in their lowest moment. Sir Gerald's expression remained conflicted. He slowly shook his head. We cannot abandon our post. Our prince ordered us to remain here, and we shall do our duty. Merlin finally lost patience. Oh, for fuck's sake. All three knights stiffened slightly at the language. I know that you are guarding Lyanna Stark, Merlin said bluntly. The words struck like a hammer. Sir Arthur Dayne stiffened visibly. Sir Oswell Went's eyes widened slightly. Only Sir Gerald remained outwardly calm. Merlin pressed on. I know she is pregnant. Prince Rhaegar told me enough, and now she is being held here. Sir Arthur Dayne's voice turned cold. She is under our protection. Protection? Merlin repeated incredulously while gesturing toward the isolated mountains. You call this protection? He pointed around them. This place is a death trap. The war is over. The prince is dead. King Aerys is dead as well. Robert Baratheon sits the Iron Throne, and he will begin hunting the remaining Targaryens, driven by his hatred for them. The words felt strange even now. You are hiding a pregnant girl in the middle of nowhere while the realm has already pledged its loyalty to the new king, and you are keeping his betrothed here. She is safe here, Sir Gerald said firmly. Merlin stared at him in disbelief. Really? Safe? His voice sharpened. Ned Stark is searching for her. The entire realm is whispering about her disappearance. How long before someone finds this place? None of them answered. You three are famous knights, spoken of as legends, Merlin admitted. But even legends die against enough men. That finally made them uneasy. You know it too, Merlin continued. Otherwise why remain hidden here instead of taking her somewhere secure? His gaze shifted toward Sir Arthur Dayne. Why did you not bring her to Starfall? Sir Arthur's jaw tightened slightly. If Dorne was truly safe, why not bring her under the protection of your own family, which is just a few days away from here? Why stay here, knowing your Prince Rhaegar would never return? Why not take her somewhere safer, somewhere safe enough for a pregnant girl? Arthur looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Interesting. Merlin immediately realized he had struck something important. The Kingsguard did not trust anyone, not even their own allies. They had hidden Lyanna here because nowhere else felt safe enough, and perhaps because Rhaegar himself had commanded it. But that command had died with the prince. You speak of duty constantly, Merlin said more quietly now. Then remember all of it. He stepped closer. Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon are alive. They are children of your prince too. Prince Viserys is still alive. Queen Rhaella still lives. His gaze swept across all three white cloaks. Will you abandon them for the sake of one unborn child? A heavy silence followed. Merlin studied the mighty knights, who now seemed lost and unmoored after the death of their king, their prince, and their comrades. With nowhere left to go, they looked like ducklings without a mother. He had come to lead them to safety, yet they stood stubborn before him. Finally, Sir Gerald Hightower sighed. The old knight suddenly looked weary, as if the weight of years had settled on him at once. The stranger speaks truth, he admitted quietly. Sir Arthur immediately turned toward him. But we swore to Prince Rhaegar. And Rhaegar is dead. We are loyal to the living, not the dead. We honor the dead and remember them as long as we live. That is our duty, Sir Gerald replied. The words landed harshly. Pain flickered briefly across Sir Arthur Dayne's face. For a moment none of them spoke. Only the endless mountain wind filled the silence. Then Sir Arthur looked toward Merlin again. Even if we leave, he said carefully, the journey itself is dangerous. The lady is close to birth. She is in greater danger remaining here, Merlin replied instantly. People are coming, maybe with a handful of men. Maybe with 50, maybe more. Sir Oswell frowned. You sound certain of that. Merlin replied, because I am. When I was sailing, I heard rumors that men from the north are heading toward Dorne. Merlin looked toward the tower as he spoke. We do not have time for her to wait and give birth here. Sir Gerald slowly rubbed a hand across his beard. What exactly do you propose? To take her to Dragonstone? Yes, take Lady Lyanna to Dragonstone, Merlin answered. There the royal family is together. There you can fulfill your vows properly without worrying about either of them. Sir Arthur still looked unconvinced. And if Dragonstone falls? Then nowhere in Westeros is safe. That earned no argument. The last light of sunset faded behind the mountains while shadows swallowed the narrow pass. The Kingsguard exchanged silent looks between themselves. Warriors deciding the fate of their oaths with nothing but glances. Finally Sir Gerald looked toward the tower. "We must speak with the lady first." Merlin nodded slowly. "Of course. 16 comments 0 vote. The decision." Sir Gerald Hightower stood silently for several moments after the discussion ended. The wind pulled at his white cloak while the fading light of evening cast long shadows across the lonely tower and the small pond beside it. At last, after a long silence spent in contemplation, the old knight turned toward Merlin. "You will wait here," he said in a calm yet firm tone. "I will speak with Lady Lyanna." Merlin nodded easily and said in a lighter tone, "Oh, don't worry, Sir Gerald. I can wait. After all, I have all the time in the world." Without another word the white bull turned and walked back toward the tower entrance. His heavy white cloak swayed behind him while his armored boots scraped softly against the rocky ground. The tower door opened and then shut behind him. Silence settled once more over the mountains. Only Sir Arthur Dayne and Sir Oswell Went remained outside now, both standing several feet away from Merlin like silent guards, as neither trusted him. Merlin could hardly blame them. Any sane person would be suspicious when facing an unknown man, especially one as handsome as himself. At least, that was the explanation he preferred to believe. After a long moment, Sir Oswell seemed unable to bear the silence between them any longer, and finally broke it. "You carry no weapon, stranger. Are you not afraid to travel unarmed?" Merlin glanced toward him lazily. The knight's dark eyes studied him from head to toe. "No sword," Sir Oswell continued. "No dagger or anything to defend yourself. You are tall, yes, but you don't look like a warrior." Sir Arthur Dayne remained quiet beside him, though his pale blue eyes stayed watchful, carrying a hint of curiosity. "And yet," Oswell said slowly, "you claim Prince Rhaegar trusted you enough to entrust his family to you." Merlin shrugged lightly but said in a teasing voice, "I have my own ways of protecting myself, unique for sure. If I showed you, I am confident you would be shocked, just as the Queen was." The answer clearly failed to impress the knight. Oswell's expression remained suspicious. "And Prince Rhaegar?" he asked. "How exactly did an unknown stranger earn the trust of the Crown Prince?" Merlin suppressed a sigh, his voice flat and lazy. "There was a deal between us." "A deal?" Arthur finally asked. Merlin nodded and spoke further. "Your prince needed help after witnessing my unique powers, and he asked for it. I offered him a deal, a way for us to trust each other, which made him accept." Neither knight looked convinced. Merlin rolled his eyes and spoke in a protesting tone, "Oh come on. How do you think I found this place?" he asked. "Prince Rhaegar told me where you were keeping her." Sir Arthur Dayne added in a calm tone, "It is not impossible to discover this tower. We were not very careful when we came here, and some men saw us riding here months ago." "Yes," Merlin said dryly. "And apparently half the peasants in this territory think this place is cursed by the gods, which is a rather clever choice for hiding a kidnapped girl." Neither of them reacted to his jab. Merlin leaned slightly against Demon while studying the two Kingsguard. It was honestly surreal. The Sword of the Morning stood only a few feet away. Sir Arthur Dayne carried himself with a quiet grace that felt almost unreal. There was no arrogance in him, no loud pride, yet one look at the man made it painfully clear why he was considered among the deadliest warriors in Westeros. And beside him stood Sir Oswell Went, sharp-eyed and constantly alert like a hunting hound waiting for danger. The tension between them lingered for several moments before Oswell spoke again. "How did the king die?" Merlin blinked. "Oh, the Mad King. No offense intended. Now everybody calls him that." Oswell nodded and spoke carefully. "None taken. We heard rumors in the surrounding villages. Rumors that are difficult to believe." Merlin let out a small breath. "Well, I don't know what you heard. Some of it may be exaggerated, some may fall short of what happened," he said slowly. "But one thing is true, the king was killed by one of your Kingsguard brothers." The reaction to Merlin's words was immediate. Sir Arthur Dayne frowned deeply, disturbed by what he had heard, while Sir Oswell stiffened and studied him in silence. "What?" Sir Arthur asked sharply. Merlin shrugged. "That's the story spreading across the realm. One of the Kingsguard slew King Aerys during the sack of King's Landing." Sir Arthur's face darkened as he spoke in a cold voice. "Who would do that? Who would break their oath and defile their honor?" "I never learned his name," Merlin replied. "Only his new title, which, to be honest, is quite poetic." The two knights waited silently. "The Kingslayer." A cold silence settled between them after Merlin spoke the title. To the Kingsguard, the idea that one of their own had slain the king felt almost unthinkable. They had trusted every sworn brother of their order, and that was what made the revelation so deeply uncomfortable. Sir Arthur Dane looked genuinely disturbed now. Oswell muttered something under his breath that Merlin could not quite hear. "Oh boy," Merlin thought silently. "You two really have no idea what happened." Then Merlin continued casually, "I also heard most of the remaining royalist forces were destroyed at the Trident. Some claim Sir Barristan Selmy survived, though wounded. Others say he was captured by the rebels." Sir Arthur closed his eyes briefly. To Merlin, it seemed the knight had finally accepted the heavy weight of defeat hanging over the Kingsguard. Everything they had sworn themselves to protect had fallen apart while they remained hidden in the mountains. Silence hung over the knights as they became lost in thought, speculating about their uncertain future and wondering which of their sworn brothers had betrayed the king. Then a sound reached them. As they listened carefully, they recognized the fast-approaching hooves of a horse echoing through the mountain pass. Sir Arthur and Sir Oswell instantly became alert. Hands moved toward sword hilts while both men turned sharply toward the sound. Merlin, who had been absently patting Demon, suddenly stopped and narrowed his eyes toward the distant path. A lone rider raced through the fading sunlight, dust trailing behind the horse while stones scattered beneath its pounding hooves. Merlin frowned. "I doubt that's Eddard Stark," he muttered. "Even Stark wouldn't be stupid enough to come here alone." Arthur stared toward the approaching rider for several seconds before relaxing slightly. "He is a friend." Merlin raised an eyebrow. "A friend?" Arthur ignored the tone entirely. The three men waited quietly while the rider drew closer. Several minutes later, the horse finally arrived beside the pond. The rider appeared young, barely more than a boy. He wore light Dornish clothing rather than armor and carried a sword at his side, though he resembled a messenger more than a warrior. The young man quickly dismounted, breathing heavily from exhaustion. Sir Arthur Dane immediately stepped forward. "What are you doing here, Miles?" he asked sharply. The young man bowed his head slightly while trying to steady his breathing. "Sir Arthur," he said urgently, "I brought a letter from Starfall." Arthur's expression sharpened instantly. "A raven arrived this morning," the young rider explained. "I rode here as quickly as possible." "Give it to me." Miles quickly removed a folded letter from inside his tunic and handed it over. Sir Arthur opened it immediately. At first his expression stayed calm while reading the contents of the letter. Then slowly his face darkened, his expression growing colder with every line. Sir Oswell noticed immediately and asked, "What does it say?" Arthur looked up, his expression grim. "It's from my brother." Merlin immediately paid closer attention, his gaze shifting toward Sir Arthur. "Lord Stark arrived at Starfall a day ago," Sir Arthur continued slowly. "He questioned my brother about where Lady Lyanna was staying." Merlin's eyes narrowed at the information as he always questioned how Eddard Stark had found this place at all. Even for him, it had taken days to reach here. He had assumed the spider might have revealed it, given his reputation for knowing everything, but it seemed Eddard didn't know Lyanna's exact location in Dorne. Sir Arthur continued speaking. "My brother denied knowing anything, which displeased the man, as he insisted that my brother or someone in the family was in contact with me and that I was with Lady Lyanna. My brother denied any involvement. Stark remained there a day before eventually learning of this place." Sir Oswell frowned. "How? As far as we know, only your brother and the young man here should know about this place. They may have searched nearby towns for our traces, but it would take a long time to find us." Sir Arthur's jaw tightened slightly. "My brother investigated afterward." He paused, as if weighing what he had read, then sighed in disappointment and spoke quietly. "It was Ashara who revealed our location. She shouldn't have known about it, but somehow that idiot sister of mine figured it out." Merlin blinked in surprise as he thought, so that's how Ned found the Tower of Joy. That explains a lot of events that were meant to unfold. Sir Oswell sighed softly. "Well," he muttered, "Lady Ashara always did have a soft spot for Starks." Sir Arthur immediately shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. Sir Oswell wisely said nothing further. Sir Arthur turned back toward Miles and asked quietly, "How many men accompany Lord Stark?" The messenger thought for a moment. "Word spread through Dorne several days ago that Lord Stark entered Dorne. At Lord Manwoody's castle, I overheard the Lord's children speaking of him." Sir Arthur frowned impatiently. "The number?" "6 men," Miles answered. "Perhaps 7 including Lord Stark himself." Merlin's expression shifted slightly. Exactly as expected, he thought, recalling from his previous life that Ned hadn't come with an army, but only a small group. He still didn't know their exact number. "They are riding hard," the messenger continued. I estimate they will arrive within 2 or 3 days depending on how much they rest. Sir Arthur nodded grimly. 2 days, perhaps. The messenger hesitated before asking carefully, should I bring more supplies, Sir Arthur? Or are we abandoning the tower? Sir Arthur looked toward the tower in silence for several moments before shaking his head. We haven't decided yet. I will speak with Sir Gerald and see what he says. Then his tone softened slightly. Your horse is exhausted. Tend to it. Miles nodded gratefully. He led the poor animal toward the pond before removing its saddle and allowing it to drink. Meanwhile, Merlin remained deep in thought. If Ned Stark arrived within 2 or 3 days, Lyanna's childbirth was likely close as well. The timing felt increasingly dangerous. Then the tower door opened again as Sir Gerald Hightower emerged. He looked toward them, and the old knight immediately sensed the tension. Sir Oswell spoke first. We received news. Lord Stark is coming. Sir Gerald frowned. You are certain? Arthur handed him the letter. My brother confirmed it. The White Bull quickly read through the message before lowering it slowly. How many men? 7, Sir Oswell answered. Possibly 8. To Merlin's surprise, Sir Gerald relaxed slightly, as though reassured, and said, then they are no threat. Merlin immediately snorted at his words, drawing a glance from the old knight. Lord Stark is young, Sir Gerald continued calmly. We can defend this tower against 7 men. Merlin folded his arms. That young boy has spent over a year fighting in a war, he said bluntly. He fought battles across half the realm, and many fine knights died at his hands. Yet he survived all of it at such a young age. Sir Gerald remained unmoved by his words, rightly so, for the old man had faced many challenges of his own. 7 men do not concern me. Oh yeah, so it was my bitch ass who died in the books, Merlin muttered quietly, swallowing the full sarcasm so he wouldn't pop the old man's delicate ego. The old knight, not knowing he had been insulted, looked at the young man and asked, where is your ship? Merlin blinked and said, in House Will territory, he answered. 2 days away by horse without stopping, though it would take longer with a pregnant girl. Sir Gerald nodded thoughtfully. I spoke with Lady Lyanna. She agreed to leave this place if necessary. Merlin straightened at once and said in a lighter tone, that's good then. Let's start the journey. However, Sir Gerald continued, I didn't tell her about Dragonstone. Merlin frowned. Why? There are complications. Which likely meant Lyanna herself knew little or nothing about Elia and Rhaella still being alive. Merlin sighed. So what now? Are we leaving or not? Sir Gerald slowly shook his head. No. Merlin stared at him blankly. No. The wet nurse believes travel would endanger both mother and child, Sir Gerald explained calmly. A wagon cannot cross these mountain paths and Lady Lyanna is too weak for horseback travel. Sir Arthur spoke quietly. She must give birth first, then we can decide whether to travel to Dragonstone. Merlin rubbed his forehead in frustration and asked, and what about Stark? When he arrives, do you think he will remain calm after learning his sister is pregnant and being held in a place like this? Sir Oswell answered immediately, we fight of course. Merlin looked at him like he had lost his mind. You're serious? The 3 Kingsguard stared back at him with identical expressions. Of course they were serious. Merlin laughed softly in disbelief. So all of you are prepared to die here fighting the brother of the woman you're supposedly protecting? If necessary, Sir Oswell replied calmly. Yes. Merlin shook his head. That is genuinely the dumbest thing I've heard since arriving in this region. Sir Arthur frowned sharply. You speak boldly for a stranger who has been here for just over an hour, he said quietly. Don't judge our decisions. You know nothing of the reasons for our actions here. Merlin shot back at him. And you people are planning mutual suicide because nobody wants to have a civil conversation. Sir Oswell's eyes narrowed slightly. Lord Stark may not come peacefully. And why wouldn't he? Merlin shot back at him too. His sister was kidnapped and raped by your prince. He lost his father and his brother because of your prince. There is nothing in him that would make him come peacefully. Sir Arthur's face hardened instantly. She was not. Careful what you say about Prince Rhaegar, Sir Oswell warned coldly. Otherwise I will cut you down for it. Merlin rolled his eyes again. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, he said it calmly. That's what Stark believes. The entire rebellion started because of it. Silence followed. You are condemning a man for searching for his missing sister, Merlin continued. A sister he believes was stolen from him for over a year. Arthur answered quietly. And if he means to harm her? Or the child? Merlin stared at him incredulously. Come on, Sir Arthur, you should know about Starks by now, shouldn't you? Sir Arthur said nothing. Family means everything to them, Merlin said. Eddard Stark crossed battlefields and kingdoms searching for her. You honestly think he would murder his own sister? None of the Kingsguard answered immediately. The wind howled softly around the tower. Finally Gerald spoke. We will decide when Lord Stark arrives. Merlin sighed heavily. Or, he said slowly, you could simply let brother and sister speak to each other first. That earned silence. Let Lady Lyanna tell him the truth herself, Merlin continued. No bloodshed is needed here. No dead Kingsguard or dead Northerners. Arthur looked uncertain at him. Merlin pressed harder. And unless all three of you are idiots, you know Lady Lyanna herself would never forgive you if her brother died protecting her. The Kingsguard exchanged quiet looks. Finally Gerald ended the discussion. We will wait. Merlin groaned internally. Fine, he muttered. I'll wait too. And so the waiting began. 2 long days passed beneath the shadow of the lonely tower. The Kingsguard prepared constantly. Armor was cleaned and polished until it gleamed white beneath the Dornish sun. Swords were sharpened, horses prepared. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing hour. Like men waiting for an execution. Merlin himself was never allowed inside the tower. Not even once, though to their credit the Kingsguard did provide him food, water, and a place near their campfire. Over those 2 days Merlin questioned them endlessly. About Lyanna, whether she was kidnapped or how Rhaegar convinced her to run away with him, and other truths about the rebellion. But the Kingsguard were maddeningly tight-lipped. Especially Sir Arthur Dayne. The man revealed almost nothing unless angered. Even then his words were measured carefully. These were not fools. They trusted Merlin only slightly more than they trusted mountain snakes. Which honestly was fair considering he had appeared out of nowhere with impossible knowledge, mysterious claims, and a letter from a queen most of Westeros probably believed powerless already. 16 comments 0 vote. Tisk. Dust moved slowly over the barren ground while the evening sun bled crimson across the horizon. The lonely tower stood against the dying light like some ancient monument forgotten by gods and men alike. Beyond the tower's stone walls, 4 men waited in silence. 3 wore white cloaks. 1 did not, as he was not a knight of the Kingsguard. Sir Gerald Hightower stood at the center with all the stillness of a mountain. Tall and broad-shouldered, the old Lord Commander of the Kingsguard carried a quiet tension within him. Beside him waited Sir Oswell Went, dark eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his helm, one hand resting lightly upon his sword. On the other side stood Sir Arthur Dayne, the sword of the morning, holding the pale blade drawn across his shoulder as though it weighed no more than air itself. A short distance away sat Merlin atop a large boulder. The young man looked entirely out of place among them. While the 3 knights stood like figures from some heroic song, Merlin lazily spun a small stick which was his wand between his fingers while staring toward the orange skies above Dorne. He appeared calm, almost bored, despite the tension lingering in the air. Suddenly the heavy wooden doors of the tower burst open, breaking the silence among the 4 men. A frightened woman hurried down the stone steps in panic. The lady is in labor, Sir Gerald, she said breathlessly. The situation is not pleasant. I came to inform you as ordered, Sir. The moment the words left her mouth, the atmosphere changed completely. Sir Gerald's expression hardened beneath his white beard. Oswell Went straightened immediately. Even Arthur Dayne's calm blue eyes darkened slightly. Faint sounds of women's voices and hurried footsteps drifted from within the tower. Somewhere above came the muffled cry of pain from a woman enduring labor. Merlin slowly raised his head toward the tower. For a brief moment, an awkward and uncomfortable silence hung over the small group. Then Merlin spoke casually. Do you have proper midwives available for Lady Stark? Arthur Dayne answered first. We brought one a month ago to tend to Lady Lyanna. She will be in safe hands. Merlin quietly mumbled under his breath while twirling the wand between his fingers. Poor woman, even the midwife got kidnapped into this mess. Oswell Went immediately shot him a sharp glare. Merlin merely smiled innocently. Before another word could be spoken, distant sounds drifted through the mountains. The slow thunder of horse hooves carried upon the desert wind. All 3 Kingsguard instantly became alert. Their heads turned toward the distant path leading toward the tower. Merlin, however, remained seated in silence as he already knew who had arrived. Then again, all of them did. Dust drifted slowly into the air as 7 riders appeared upon the horizon. The closer they came, the clearer they became beneath the fading sunlight. At their head rode Eddard Stark. Merlin studied him quite attentively. The young Lord of Winterfell looked exhausted beyond measure. War and grief had carved themselves deeply into his face despite his youth. He possessed a long solemn face, gray eyes cold as northern skies, and dark brown hair that moved lightly beneath the wind. When the riders finally stopped before the tower, Eddard Stark dismounted first. The northern lord's eyes immediately settled upon the 3 white cloaks standing before him. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward Merlin. The strange young man leaned lazily against a boulder while playing with a small stick in his hand. There was no visible weapon on him and he looked completely harmless. Ned ignored him for now as his attention returned to the familiar faces. He had once admired them deeply, even wanting to be like them. He had grown up listening to bards and their tales of the Kingsguard, stories that pushed him to practice his sword even when he felt lazy or weak. No one spoke as they looked at each other in silence while the wind whispered through the mountains and through the tower, filling the stillness with its fury. Then Sir Gerald Hightower gave a small nod. "Lord Stark." Ned looked directly at him. "I looked for you on the Trident." Gerald Hightower's deep voice answered calmly. "And we weren't there. I saw the aftermath at King's Landing," Ned continued quietly. "The city burned. The king you swore to protect lay dead upon the Iron Throne." A faint smile touched Oswell Went's lips beneath his helm. "And yet we are still here even after everything is lost." Ned's expression hardened. "The Mad King is dead. Prince Rhaegar is dead. The war is done." "No," Sir Gerald replied steadily. "The war has not even begun." Behind Ned, several of his companions shifted uneasily. Merlin watched the exchange with interest while continuing to twirl the wand between his fingers. Ned slowly glanced toward the tower. "I came from my sister." At those words Arthur Dayne finally lifted his gaze fully toward the Lord of Winterfell. "She is not yours to take." Anger flashed through Ned's eyes instantly. "She is my blood and I am here to bring her home." "And she is under our protection," Arthur answered calmly. "As commanded by our prince." Ned stepped forward slightly. "Protection?" he asked bitterly. "Is that what your prince called kidnapping? Protecting her from whom? From me. I should be the one protecting her from all of you." Oswell Went rested his hand upon his sword. "You understand little of what happened here, Stark." "Then explain it to me," Ned demanded. "Why did Prince Rhaegar kidnap my sister?" Silence of the knights answered him. Merlin's lips curved slightly as he watched the exchange. "Well," Eddard Stark sounded entirely reasonable. Ned's eyes slowly narrowed at their silence. "When King's Landing fell, Sir Jaime slew the king he swore to protect. Lord Tywin butchered the remaining loyalists and laid their corpses before Robert wrapped in crimson cloaks. Storm's End starved under the siege of Lord Mace Tyrell after the death of the Mad King. Every loyalist either bent the knee or died." His voice grew colder. "You are alone, the last fool still standing for a dead cause." Sir Gerald did not move even slightly. "We swore a vow." "To a dead man," said Ned. "To the rightful king," Gerald answered. At those words realization slowly crossed Ned's face. "You mean Viserys," he said quietly. "The boy hiding on Dragonstone." "No," Arthur Dayne said softly. The answer lingered heavily in the air. Ned slowly turned toward the tower once more. Something changed in his expression. Understanding slowly dawned on him, touched by dread. Inside that tower was not merely Lyanna Stark. There was something else, something these men considered worth dying for. Ned's hand slowly tightened around the hilt of ice. "Does my sister know what this war has cost?" he asked quietly. "Does she know our father burned alive? That Brandon died screaming for her? That thousands have died?" Arthur's expression showed the faintest trace of sorrow. "She knows." "In Rhaegar?" Ned demanded sharply. "Did he know what would happen when he took her?" Even the Kingsguard remained silent for several moments. Finally Arthur spoke. "Prince Rhaegar believed there was a purpose greater than crowns and rebellions." Ned's eyes darkened. "He burned the realm for what? For some greater purpose?" Arthur gave no answer. Instead Oswell Went said quietly. "You came a long way to ask questions whose answers you wouldn't understand." Ned slowly looked between the 3 white cloaks before him. There were only 3 men. Yet none of them showed even the slightest fear against 7 hardened survivors of war. Ned exhaled deeply. "I don't wish to fight you. Nor do we wish to fight you, Lord Stark," Gerald answered. "Turn around and go back to North, back to your family." "I am here for my sister. I will not leave without her." "We cannot allow that. You would die here." Arthur Dayne slowly unsheathed dawn. The pale sword reflected the fading sunlight with an almost unreal glow. Silver blue light shimmered along its surface like moonlight frozen into steel. Behind Ned, swords slowly left their sheaths one after another. Steel hissed softly through the desert air as Ned looked toward Arthur with sadness and said, "I once believed you were the finest knight in the Seven Kingdoms." Arthur gave the faintest smile. "And what about now? Now I wonder whether you were simply a loyal man serving the wrong cause." Arthur lowered Don into guard. "The cause is all that remains for us. It is either the cause or death." Ned slowly pulled ice free from its sheath as the greatsword's dark steel drank the fading sunlight. "I suppose there is no other way." "No," said Sir Gerald Hightower. "There is not." The old knight slowly placed his helm upon his head. "We swore a vow, Stark." The atmosphere itself seemed ready to erupt into bloodshed. Then suddenly a loud sigh echoed across the battlefield. Everyone paused. Merlin rose from the boulder while stretching lazily. "Okay, that's enough of this shitshow," he muttered. Every eye immediately turned toward him. Merlin brushed dust from his clothes before looking directly at the Kingsguard. "Did we not already discuss this earlier, Sir Gerald?" he asked calmly. "About not immediately butchering each other the moment Lord Stark arrived." Sir Gerald Hightower's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Stay silent, Merlin. This does not concern you. It is between us." For a brief moment, the air grew heavier as Merlin exhaled slowly, looking toward the old man. "Honestly," he said, almost tiredly and disappointedly, "you knights are stubborn fools. I can't believe you reached the position of Kingsguard." His gaze swept over them, calm but sharper now. "Now I understand why the Mad King lost his mind. It is because of people like you around him, which led to where we are now. I have been telling you for days to be reasonable, but nobody listens to someone like me." Ned Stark frowned, clearly unsettled by the stranger who spoke as if none of this were life or death. Merlin tilted his head slightly. Then he raised his wand. A couple of thin beam of lights shot forward before anyone could react. Petrificus Totalis. The spells struck instantly. The three Kingsguard froze mid-movement, like statues carved from stone with exquisite details. Sir Gerald Hightower stood rigid, unmoving as iron. Sir Oswell Went's hand hovered half-drawn toward his sword. Sir Arthur Dane, the sword of the morning, remained fixed in place, Dawn angled forward, its pale blade catching the dying light. They could not move, frozen mid-motion, nor could they speak, but their eyes remained alive, fully aware of everything around them. Merlin watched them for a moment, almost disappointed rather than victorious. "And to be honest," he said quietly, "it was my fault for trying to be civilized. I tried not to scare you with what I am." He stepped forward slowly, boots pressing into the dusty ground. "But it seems my words meant nothing to you," he said quietly. "You spoke about your prince as though there was some glorious purpose behind everything he did, as though sacrificing thousands of lives could somehow be justified. Let us not even speak of the crown, since that was already ruined beyond repair. But the realm, what was he trying to accomplish by running away with the daughter of one Lord Paramount and the betrothed of another? He knew it would spark conflict. Yet he was arrogant enough to believe the world would bend around him because he believed his actions served some greater good." His tone hardened slightly. A prince who thought he could reshape the realm because he convinced himself he understood it better than everyone else. Merlin stopped in front of Sir Gerald Hightower. The Lord Commander stood frozen, forced to meet his gaze as Merlin leaned in, voice dropping to a murmur. "So I will make the decision for you." He straightened again. "You will not interfere any longer," Merlin said, his gaze shifting briefly to the tower. "And from this moment on, you are no longer responsible for Lyanna Stark or her child." Ned Stark's breath caught sharply. "What did you do to them?" Ned demanded, voice tight with fear and disbelief. Merlin turned toward him, expression softening instantly into something almost friendly again. "Oh Eddard Stark," he said warmly, "it is an honor. Truly." He gestured lightly with his wand as if this were a casual meeting rather than a nightmare unfolding for the Northerners. "I hope our introduction was not too overwhelming for you." Ned's grip tightened on ice as he looked at the man who continued speaking with an almost careless cheerfulness. "And them, don't worry, they are just frozen for a little while. Nothing permanent." The words did not calm anyone. If anything, they made the silence worse. Ned took a cautious step back. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lowered. "No, what are you?" Merlin tilted his head. "A wizard. You people might not be familiar with the word, but it is just a sorcerer." "A powerful one," he said calmly. "A sorcerer," one of them repeated under his breath. Merlin nodded. "Yes, something like that." He stepped closer to Ned, slow and unthreatening, though every movement still made the northern men tense. Steel was raised immediately, swords pointed toward him. Merlin stopped and glanced at the blades with mild annoyance. "Oh come on," he muttered. "Put away those toys, gentlemen. You cannot hurt me with that." He raised an eyebrow. "Or do you want to end up like them?" His eyes flicked toward the frozen Kingsguard. That single glance made the tension sharpen even further. The Northerners didn't lower their weapons. They were men who had survived war, betrayal, and loss. Yielding was not in their nature. Merlin sighed at their actions but still ignored them. He turned back to Ned Stark, a faint smile returning to his face. "Congratulations, Lord Stark," he said lightly. Ned blinked in confusion. "Congratulations." Merlin's gaze shifted toward the tower. "You are about to become an uncle." For a moment, the world seemed to stop around Ned as his expression cracked instantly. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. His voice rose, sharper now, stripped of caution and fear as he looked toward the tower. "What is happening to my sister?" Merlin followed his gaze toward the tower doors. Then he answered calmly, "She is giving birth." The words landed like a blow as Ned Stark staggered slightly, as though struck physically, and ice nearly slipped from his grip. "No," he whispered. The denial came out broken, almost childlike. Merlin watched him carefully, his tone softening slightly. "That is why they were so desperate to stop you," he said. "They were not trying to deceive you. They were trying to prevent exactly this." He glanced toward Sir Gerald Hightower. "Lady Lyanna is in pain. Fear. Exhaustion. If she believes her brother is dying outside those walls, it will only make things worse." His expression hardened slightly again. "I tried to tell them to resolve it peacefully. But as you can see, they prefer dying for vows rather than using common sense." Ned's eyes flicked toward the frozen Kingsguard. Something shifted in him. Fear lingered, but now confusion crept in too. "And you," Ned said slowly. "You did this to them because they would not let me pass." Merlin shrugged lightly. "I did this because they refused to stop escalating a situation that didn't need bloodshed and also they were in my way." He gestured slightly. "Now you can go inside and meet your sister," he said. Ned moved past him, and his men started to follow. Merlin raised his wand and shook his head. "Tisk, tisk, tisk. Only Lord Stark can enter. You cannot go inside the chamber of a woman in labor. Or is this some northern custom to watch a woman give birth?" The lords exchanged embarrassed looks. Ned hesitated, caught between distrust and urgency. Finally he gave a single sharp nod. "I will go alone," he said quietly as he turned toward his companions. One of them immediately protested. "That is not wise, my lord. He could be leading you into a trap." Ned slowly shook his head. "She is my sister, and I want to go alone. It is better for me and her to be alone at a time like this," he said quietly, not waiting for their response. At that exact moment, a scream rang out from inside the tower. A woman's scream, raw and filled with agony. Ned's entire body stiffened. "Lyanna." He didn't wait any longer as he ran toward the tower, and when he reached it, the doors opened with a heavy groan and swallowed him whole. Silence returned outside the tower. Merlin watched the man depart, then let out a slow breath. "Childbirth in this era," he muttered. "Absolutely brutal." He turned to face the remaining men. The frozen Kingsguard still stood like statues. The Northerners still held their weapons, though uncertainty now lingered in their posture. Merlin raised his wand slightly again as his voice became firm. "Stay here. Don't enter the tower." His gaze shifted toward the path beside the tower. "There is food and water over there. You have been traveling too long. Eat and rest. You will be staying here for some time." One of the Northerners frowned but did not argue. Merlin added calmly, "And don't touch the frozen ones. Unless you want to join them." That earned him a few uneasy glances. Still, no one moved. They were not obeying him out of respect, only because they didn't understand him enough to challenge him further. Merlin ignored that as his attention shifted back to the tower. Another scream echoed faintly through the stone. Longer this time. Ding. Host used 200 fate points to purchase healing potion test tube. He tightened his grip around the small green vial in his hand. It was a healing potion. He stared at it for a moment longer, then sighed again. "Let's finish what I came for," he said quietly. Without waiting for permission from anyone, frozen Kingsguard or Northerners, he walked forward, step by step toward the Tower of Joy. 36 comments 0 vote. You know nothing. As Merlin stepped into the Tower of Joy, the screams had already died away. Heavy silence pressed down on the ancient stone corridors, broken only by the flickering of torches that fought a losing battle against the darkness. He climbed the long, winding staircase, his footsteps echoing softly up toward the birthing chamber where the cries had torn through the air only moments earlier. The labor was finished. The child had been born. He reached the upper level, the long climb finally opening onto a broader landing. Stone chambers lined the walls, but his attention went at once to the single door left slightly open. Warm light spilled into the dim corridor in a thin stream of gold. From inside came quiet voices, low and weary, speaking in the aftermath of something both miraculous and tragic. Merlin slowed as he approached, then came to a stop at the doorway. From inside, a voice reached him, weak and trembling, yet carrying a weight that felt as though it would remain etched into memory forever. "Promise me, Ned, promise me." Merlin stepped slightly closer and looked inside. The chamber was dim, lit only by the unsteady glow of torchlight. At its center stood a large bed, the sheets twisted and darkly stained from a single brutal hour of labor. Upon it lay a young girl, deathly pale and fragile, her skin almost translucent in the flickering light. Tears streamed silently down her face from gray eyes shimmering with exhaustion. She looked one breath away from slipping into unconsciousness, held together by nothing more than sheer willpower. "Pick." Eddard Stark sat beside her, leaning forward as she clung tightly to his arm. His face looked worn, the skin around his eyes red with exhaustion, as though he had not allowed himself a moment to rest. The calm composure he usually carried was gone. In its place was something raw and painfully human, a vulnerability no title or honor could hide. At the far end of the chamber stood 3 women. One of them, older than the others and more familiar with moments like this, held a small bundle carefully in her arms. Wrapped tightly in cloth, it rose and fell with the soft rhythm of tiny breaths. A newborn child. The room was quiet, yet heavy with emotion. It lingered in every corner, in the careful breaths, in the silence between words, and in the glances that turned away from truths too painful to face. Merlin cleared his throat gently before stepping further inside. He spoke with an easy tone that didn't quite match the gravity of the moment. "Ah, sorry to interrupt your emotional moment." Eddard Stark turned his head slowly. His gaze found Merlin's, his own eyes clouded with exhaustion and confusion. For a moment he seemed unable to comprehend the familiar yet alien figure standing in a place far too intimate for any intruder. Merlin gave a faint, almost apologetic smile, though something in it remained unreadable. He moved toward the bedside without hesitation. From within his robes, he drew a small vial filled with a glowing green liquid. It caught the torchlight as it shifted, as though it carried a faint, steady pulse of its own. He lifted the glowing vial and gave it a small, absent swirl, the green liquid catching the light before settling again. Then he offered it toward Lyanna. "Here," he said, his voice calm and assured. "Drink this. It will erase every trace of the ordeal. You will be whole again, as though the labor never touched you. Strong in body, clear in mind, and reborn in strength." Lyanna Stark turned her head slightly toward him, her expression tightening at once into resistance. Even in her weakened state, there was a stubborn pride in her eyes, quiet but unyielding. "I can't," she said, her voice strained. "I'm not going to make it, Maester. Don't trouble yourself with medicines." Merlin's expression darkened, not with anger but with a kind of impatience born from watching people refuse help when they needed it most. "Drink this, you stupid girl. Since when do patients know more than healers?" Before she could respond, he guided the vial to her lips with quiet firmness. The movement was careful but unyielding. The glowing liquid slipped into her mouth, fading as she swallowed. Lyanna's eyes widened slightly at the strange warmth that followed, but she did not resist. Merlin supported her head with one hand to ensure she did not choke, keeping her steady as she swallowed. Woozy face, winking face. "And for the record," he added calmly, "I am not a maester or anything of that sort." Eddard Stark's voice cut through the silence, tense and edged with uncertainty. "If you are not, then what exactly are you making her drink?" He watched every movement closely, his protective instincts rising even through his exhaustion and the fear that lingered in the presence of the man before him. Merlin glanced toward him briefly, then returned his attention to Lyanna until the vial was empty. Only then did he answer. "A healing potion," he said. "A very rare thing, almost impossible to find anywhere in Westeros or Essos or any other land you might care to name." He lowered the empty vial and placed it back within his robes. Sleep was pulling Lyanna under, soft and persistent. Her hold on Ned's arm weakened by degrees, her fingers loosening even as she fought to stay present. Her breathing slowed, growing deeper and slower, but her mind still drifted at the edge of wakefulness. What is happening to her? Ned asked urgently as he saw her eyes begin to close. Merlin looked at Lyanna before answering. She is about to sleep. She needs rest after labor. The potion has done its work. The worse the condition, the deeper the sleep required for recovery. She was on the verge of death, Lord Stark. This sleep may last a while, but it is not death. Far from it. He gestured faintly toward her face. Look at her face. The color is returning. Eddard looked, and it was true. The ghostly stillness that had gripped her was fading, replaced by a softer, warmer vitality. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, though concern still shadowed his eyes. I thought I lost you too, he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. Lyanna didn't answer. Her eyes were already closed, and she had fallen asleep. Merlin stepped back slightly, observing her condition with quiet satisfaction. Then his gaze shifted toward the bundled child held by the midwife. It was time for him to look at the boy who knows nothing, so he walked over. The older woman holding the baby stiffened immediately as he approached, instinctively tightening her grip. The two younger women behind her exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they should step forward or away. Merlin stopped at a respectful distance and let out a faint, gentle smile. So this is the little rascal who caused all this trouble. He leaned slightly forward, studying the small face wrapped in cloth. The infant was calm, almost unsettlingly so. There was no crying, no fussing, only the steady rhythm of sleep, much like his mother. He extended a finger carefully and brushed it near the child, not touching fully but close enough to acknowledge its presence. The baby stirred faintly but did not wake. He murmured under his breath, almost to himself. So, the black dragon is finally hatched. The midwife blinked at him, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. Merlin looked up at her. Why is he sleeping? Aren't newborns usually meant to cry loudly when they come into the world? The midwife offered a nervous smile, adjusting her hold on the child. He cried a little at first, she said carefully. Then he fell asleep after he was cleaned. Merlin nodded slowly, as if accepting an interesting but incomplete answer. Unusual, he said. He straightened and turned back toward Eddard Stark, who had risen slightly from the bedside, still holding Lyanna's hand. You are awfully silent for an uncle, Merlin said lightly. Eddard didn't answer at once. His eyes stayed on Lyanna, watching the rise and fall of her chest as if looking away might make the reality of it disappear. It has been more than a year since I last saw her, he said quietly. And now I find her here, with a child. She is far too young to be a mother. I never imagined her as one. Merlin raised a brow, curiosity flickering in his expression. And why is that? Ned gave a small, tired smile, still not looking away from his sister. She was never the sort to act like a lady. Merlin let out a soft, amused sound. That is an interesting way to describe your own sister. Ned gave a faint laugh. She had a fiery nature. She loved riding horses and never cared much for what was expected of her. She was willful, stubborn. Why do you speak of her as though it is all in the past? Merlin asked. Ned's smile faded. I don't know her anymore. I don't know what she has suffered here, or with that man. I don't know if she is still the Lyanna I remember, or someone I can no longer recognize. Merlin glanced toward Lyanna and then back at him. You will find out when she wakes up from her nap. Merlin exhaled quietly as his gaze drifted to the bed, still stained from the ordeal. Without warning, he raised his wand and murmured a cleaning charm under his breath. A soft breeze moved through the chamber, gentle and precise, like unseen waves flowing through the air. The blood on the sheets and garments around the bed began to fade, dissolving as if time itself were undoing its marks. Lyanna's clothes, too, were restored to clean fabric. The bed became fresh once more, and even the faint metallic scent in the air vanished, leaving only the light fragrance of flowers to fill the room. The two younger women standing behind the midwife gasped softly. What was that? One of them whispered. What happened to the blood? The other murmured in disbelief. Merlin turned toward them with a polite smile. Ladies, you have worked hard. Go and rest. The child and his mother are safe now. He nodded toward the midwife. And you can give the child to his uncle. Reluctantly, the midwife stepped forward and carefully placed the bundled infant into Eddard Stark's arms. Eddard held the child awkwardly at first, as though afraid he might break something far more fragile than glass. Then slowly, instinct took over. His grip steadied, his expression softened in a way that few had ever seen. He looked down at the boy. Merlin watched him for a moment, then spoke again. I expected you to draw your steel the moment I entered, he said casually. And then say something like stay away, or I will protect her, or I will kill you for harming my sister." Eddard did not look up. "That would have been foolish," he said quietly. "Especially after seeing what you did to the Kingsguard outside the tower. I don't have the strength to fight an unknown power. I am a soldier. I have always handled swords, and I have never seen anything like what you did out there. I know my limitations." A faint smile touched Merlin's lips. "I do like you, Stark. You are a sensible man." Eddard finally raised his eyes. "Would you have killed me, if I had tried to stop you?" Merlin considered the question for a moment before answering with calm honesty. "I would have stopped you," he said. "Whether that would have required killing depends on how determined you were to be a problem. But you should consider yourself fortunate that it did not come to that. I am not patient with people who create problems for me, and you did not seem like one of them." The honesty of it made Eddard uneasy, but he said nothing. Instead, he looked back at the child and watched him in silence. "Did she name him?" Merlin asked. "Did she say anything before I arrived?" Ned shook his head. "No." "Then she will name him when she wakes," Merlin said softly. Merlin tilted his head slightly. "If it were you, what would you name him, Lord Stark?" Eddard's gaze stayed on the child for a long moment. His expression tightened with emotion he did not fully let show. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet sorrow beneath its calm. "Brandon, or perhaps Rickard." Merlin raised an eyebrow. "In memory of your father and brother, I assume." Eddard nodded once. "Yes." Merlin gave a quiet, thoughtful hum. "A northern name for a Targaryen child," he said softly. Eddard's head snapped up slightly, his expression hardening. "He is a Stark. He will not be Targaryen." The words hung between them like a blade laid on a table. Merlin met his gaze without flinching. "He is both," he said simply. "A wolf pup and a dragon hatchling together. You cannot erase half of what he is, Lord Stark. The boy in your arms is born of both bloodlines." Eddard tightened his hold slightly, though not out of anger toward the child, but out of conflict within himself. Merlin continued, his voice quiet. "How ironic," he said. "The first child born of a Stark in a Targaryen union. As far as I know, there has never been one before. This child is the first between the two families." Eddard spoke again, more controlled now. "There have been incidents before. Bastards. Children of lesser houses. None survived. And there has never been a marriage between Stark and Targaryen, not since the Hour of the Wolf. That incident destroyed any hope of a union between the two families. The North does not wish to involve itself in southern politics. That is why there has never been a political marriage." Merlin listened, then looked down at the child again. "A unique dragon," he said softly. "With the heart of the North." He smiled faintly. 20 comments 0 vote. The truth. Eddard Stark's POV. The stone walls of the Tower of Joy felt heavier than any armor Eddard Stark had ever worn. He stood outside the chamber for what felt like an eternity, though the midwife had told him only moments ago that Lyanna had finally awakened. The news should have brought relief, perhaps even joy, yet it settled in his chest like a weight he could not lift. Lyanna. The name alone brought back memories Eddard had spent the past year trying to bury. Everything that followed, the bloodshed, the fire, the ruin of countless lives, had begun with her disappearance. It had been the first crack in the peace of the realm. Then the Mad King murdered Brandon and their father in King's Landing, and that crack split wide enough to drag the Seven Kingdoms into war. Now every loss, every wound left behind by the rebellion, felt tied to the same thread that had led him here, to this lonely tower in Dorne. She was alive behind that door, yet no longer the same. Eddard Stark closed his eyes for a moment, one hand resting against the rough wood of the door. For a brief second, he considered turning away. There was no battle waiting for him behind that door, no fire or blood for him to face. It was the truth he feared. Lyanna's truth. What had happened to her after her disappearance, what she had suffered in this lonely tower. Deep down, he knew that hearing it might break something inside him that could never be repaired. Yet he had come too far to turn back now. Gathering what courage he could, Eddard pushed the door open. The chamber was quiet, softened by pale light spilling through the narrow windows. A faint scent of flowers lingered in the air. Everything felt strangely still, so different from the scene he had witnessed the day before. And there she was. Lyanna Stark sat upon the bed where she had given birth the night before. Her posture was upright, almost full of energy. She did not look like a woman who had endured childbirth only hours ago. When he entered, she had been gazing out the window, but slowly she turned her head to look back at him. A heavy silence fell between them. For a moment they did nothing but look into each other's eyes. Then she smiled. It was unmistakably her smile. He remembered it from Winterfell, from cold mornings in windswept courtyards, from a girl who once ran through snow with more defiance than caution. But the smile she wore now was different. It still held warmth, yet it was softened by exhaustion and sorrow, as though even joy had become something she had to hold on to carefully to keep it from slipping away. "Brother," she said softly. The word struck him harder than any blade. "Lyanna," he answered, and for a brief moment his voice almost failed him. He stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him. An awkward silence stretched between them again. Finally, he spoke again, more carefully this time. "How are you feeling now? Do you have any pain? Anything at all?" She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "I feel better now, much better than I have in a very long time." A faint, weary smile touched her lips. "The draft that man gave me yesterday helped more than I ever expected." Eddard Stark studied her face carefully. He saw no trace of exhaustion, no lines of pain or discomfort. She looked better than he had dared hope. That knowledge should have steadied him, yet his heart still hammered against his ribs. Because he knew that alive did not mean safe, and safe did not mean unchanged. He stepped closer, but kept a careful distance. Something fragile still lingered between them, like ice beginning to thaw but not yet strong enough to stand on. "Have you seen your son?" he asked quietly. "Where is he now?" At that, something softened in her expression. A light that had been dim returned for a moment. "Yes, I saw him earlier. He fell asleep not long before you came. Solia is taking care of him for now." Eddard nodded, though he did not know who Solia was. He assumed she was one of the girls he had seen with the midwife. The silence returned once again between them, heavier this time, filled with everything that remained unsaid. Then Lyanna's composure began to break. It started in her eyes, a flicker of pain surfacing as she looked at him. Then the tears came, sudden and unstoppable, spilling down her cheeks as though they had been waiting far too long for permission to fall. In that moment, it looked as if she finally felt safe with him. She reached for him, and he caught her. Eddard Stark wrapped his arms around his sister as she collapsed into him, her sobs shaking her whole body. For a moment, he only held her, one hand resting gently at the back of her head, the other steadying her as though she might otherwise break completely. She clung to him as if afraid he might disappear. "I am sorry," she whispered through broken breath. "I am so sorry, Ned. It was because of me. All of it, Father." "Brandon." His grip tightened instinctively. "Shush," he said quietly, though his voice carried its own pain. "It wasn't your fault, Lyanna. Don't speak as though it was. You were only a girl." His tone hardened slightly, not at her, but at the memory that rose unbidden in his mind. The silver-haired prince, the source of all the unspeakable rumors about him and his sister. The prince whose actions had led the realm into fire. Rhaegar Targaryen. "It wasn't your fault," he repeated, more firmly. "You were a girl who was taken. The rest, the war, the deaths, that began with Rhaegar and the folly of kings and lords. Not with you." Lyanna trembled in his arms as she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. Elle was not kidnapped, Ned." The words did not immediately register. Eddard froze slightly, his hand still resting on her back. "What did you say?" She pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were red and swollen, yet steady in a way that unsettled him more than her tears had. "I was not kidnapped by Rhaegar." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Eddard took a step back without realizing it, his hands falling away from her. "That is not possible," he said slowly. "Lyanna, you must understand what you are saying." Her voice broke again, but she didn't look away. I went with him willingly." Silence filled the room completely, swallowing every sound. Eddard stared at her as though she had spoken in another language. Then, very carefully, he asked, "What do you mean willingly?" Lyanna lowered her gaze and didn't answer at once. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, as though she were searching for words that would not condemn her further. And Eddard waited, but the waiting itself soon became unbearable. "Did he threaten you?" he asked, his voice tightening. "Did he take you by fear or lies? Tell me, Lyanna." She shook her head once. "No," she whispered. Eddard frowned sharply. "No." Her hands twisted in the sheets. She looked smaller now, like a child caught between confession and punishment. "He didn't threaten me," she said. "I went because I wanted to." Her words struck him harder than any blade he had faced in the war. Eddard took a step back, as though the bed itself had become dangerous. He studied her face, searching desperately for something that did not belong there. Madness, confusion, manipulation, anything at all. But all he saw was guilt. And something worse, regret. A cold disbelief spread through him. "Tell me, Lyanna," he said, his voice low and strained by what he had just heard. "Tell me the truth. Was it love? Is that what this is? Is that why father lies dead? Is that why Brandon screamed your name while he died in chains? Is that why the North bled for you?" Her breath hitched, and her face crumpled at the mention of their father and brother. "I didn't know," she replied, tears streaming down her face, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I didn't know it would become like this." Eddard's anger flared as he still had no answer. His voice rose, sharp with frustration. "Tell me." The command made her flinch. It was unlike her usual gentle brother. This time he was colder, sharper, and it broke something in her, sending her into sobs. "I only wanted to be free," she cried. "I didn't want to marry Robert." The words fell between them like shattered glass. Ned stared at her in disbelief, the name of his best friend leaving his lips almost in shock. "Robert Baratheon. That is why you ran," he said slowly, as if testing the absurdity of it. "Because you did not wish to marry Robert." Lyanna shook her head desperately. "I was angry," she said. "Father sent me to Riverrun after he received a letter from Robert inviting me to a small tourney he was hosting. He told me to go to Riverrun and join Brandon so he could take me to Storm's End after he visited his betrothed, Catelyn Tully." She continued after a brief pause. "I argued with him because I didn't want to go. I wrote to Rhaegar in anger, thinking he would understand, thinking he was my friend. I believed he could help me speak to father, that as a prince he could convince him otherwise about my betrothal. But Rhaegar came to me during the journey and told me to come with him. He said he would take me around Riverrun, and I agreed. I thought it would only be for a short time, and after Robert's tourney ended, I would return to the north." Her voice trembled more with every word. "I didn't mean for it to come to this. By the time I decided to return," she whispered, "it was already too late." Ned's voice turned colder than before. "Then why did you not come back when the whole realm was at war? Why did you not even send word to me, to Benjen, to anyone? Just something to say you were safe, that you would return, that we need not worry." Her hands shook as she wiped her face. "I couldn't," she said. "Everything had already begun by the time I learned the truth about father and Brandon. The realm was already burning because of what people believed. I had no idea my disappearance had been taken that way. I was afraid no one would believe me, that I had simply wanted to be away from home and did not want to go to Storm's End for the tourney." Ned let out a slow breath, one that sounded almost like exhaustion. "So thousands died," he said quietly, "because you were afraid." Lyanna flinched at the weight of his words. Then, in a quiet, sorrowful voice, she whispered, "I'm sorry." The chamber felt smaller with every word spoken. Ned turned away for a moment, pressing a hand against the edge of the bed as though to steady himself. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but something brittle lingered beneath it. "And the child?" Lyanna went still. The uncomfortable silence Ned had begun to hate returned once again, heavier than before. Ned looked back at her. "The child," he repeated. "How did that happen?" Her lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Rhaegar said it was the only way." Ned's head lifted sharply. "What?" Her voice grew faint, as if she hated every word she spoke. He said the war with North would not end unless there was a union between us, a child of both bloodlines. A child that could bind the realm together and calm the North for what happened to father and Brandon. He said that after the child was born, he would go to King's Landing, dethrone his father, and reveal the truth. He would make our child a prince with northern blood, an heir to the throne, and said that would calm the anger of the North. Ned stared at her in disbelief, as if she had gone mad and was speaking nothing but absurdities. "You believed that," he said flatly. Lyanna's eyes filled again. "I wanted to believe it. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was lost," she said. A heavy silence lingered in the room for a moment longer before it shifted into something more awkward, something neither of them seemed ready to face. Ned finally turned away from her completely, as if he could no longer bear to look at her. "So that was it," he said in low voice. Lyanna wiped her face again, but the tears would not stop. Ned let out a slow breath through his nose. "And Robert," he asked, "was he so unbearable that you chose this instead?" At that, something sharp flickered in Lyanna's expression. I would have spent my life bearing his children while he filled the Stormlands with bastards, she said quietly, her voice bitter. I told father I didn't want him. I told him Robert was notorious for sleeping with every woman who caught his eye, that he already had a bastard girl on some commoner. I warned him the man would never be faithful. She let out a shaky breath. But father would not listen. He said it was my duty. That it didn't matter how many bastards Robert sired, our children would still be the heirs to Storm's End. He told me if I refused, he would marry me to someone worse. A Frey, perhaps, or some landless knight. He said I was too young to understand such matters, that he knew what was best for me, and that Robert would make me happy. Ned shook his head slightly. You know father would not have married you off to a Frey or to a sworn swordsman, he said quietly. He only said that to frighten you out of your stubbornness. Lyanna's voice dropped. I know, she admitted. I knew even then. That admission struck Ned like a physical blow. He lowered his head and covered his face with both hands. For a long moment he could not speak. So you chose Rhaegar, he finally said, voice hoarse. A married man, a prince with a wife and heirs already. You lay with him and bore his child, out of wedlock. He lifted his gaze to her, eyes heavy with sorrow and disappointment. You told father you would not marry Robert because he might be unfaithful. And yet this is what you chose instead. Lyanna's voice broke again. My son is not a bastard, she said firmly, almost desperately. He is lawful. Rhaegar and I were wed. Ned's eyes widened in shock as he heard her words. His voice rose, sharp and disbelieving. You married him. At that, Lyanna lifted her head slightly. We were married, she said, her voice tightening with a sudden, desperate firmness, as though holding on to the words was the only way to keep herself from falling apart. In Riverrun, after everything that happened, after I agreed to have a child with Rhaegar, we didn't want it to be born out of wedlock. So we were lawfully wed before a septon there. You think that changes anything? Ned said sharply. You think the faith of the Seven would accept that marriage is lawful? He already had a wife, Lyanna, Ned said, staring at her as though he could not believe what he was hearing. A wife and children. Did he truly convince you that a few vows spoken in secret would make the realm accept it? The faith would never allow it. The lords would never allow it. Lyanna lifted her head slightly, tears still wet upon her face. Rhaegar said the Targaryens were different, she murmured. That they had never always followed the same laws as other men. She hesitated before continuing. Aegon the Conqueror had 2 wives. Visenya and Rhaenys. Both were queens. Their children were legitimate. Her fingers tightened together. He told me the old rights of his house still mattered. That our marriage would be lawful because of his blood. That our child would never be called a bastard. Ned let out a short, disbelieving breath, almost bitter. That ended long before we were born, he said quietly. The faith only endured those marriages because the Targaryens had dragons then. His jaw tightened slightly. But there are no dragons anymore. No High Septon would recognize such a union now. And no lord in the realm would accept it as lawful. Lyanna's voice rose slightly, defensive now, as though she were trying to keep the fragile pieces of her argument from breaking apart. He said he would end the rebellion, she whispered. That once he returned to King's Landing he would remove his father from power and set things right. She hesitated then, her eyes lowering briefly. And afterward, he said he would reveal the truth about us. About the marriage. She hesitated for a moment, then added more softly. He said our child would be a bridge between the North and the South. A prince of peace. Ned's brow tightened. A prince, he repeated sharply. How did he know that? That it would be a boy? What if it had been a girl? Lyanna did not answer. Ned's expression darkened as understanding turned slowly into something colder. So that was it, he said at last, his voice lower now, controlled but heavy with disbelief. You did all of this on hope, on chance. On the smallest possibility that the child you carried would be a boy, and that he would be accepted. Legitimized. Made into what he promised you in words alone. Lyanna's expression faltered. He is still legitimate, she insisted weakly. Ned looked at her for a long moment. And then he shook his head. You truly believed that, he said quietly. That all of this would be undone by words spoken after enough blood was spilled. Lyanna did not argue. Ned's jaw tightened as he stepped in again, his voice rising with restrained frustration. Ned shook his head again, slower this time. Robert would never have accepted it, he said quietly. You know that. He rubbed a tired hand across his face before looking back at her. He loved you, or at least the idea he had of you. And once the war began, he let out a hollow breath. No declaration of marriage would have stopped him then. He still would have raised his banners. He still would have fought Rhaegar. Lyanna shook her head immediately, tears returning to her eyes. No, she said firmly. He didn't love me like that. Everything that happened, it gave him a reason. A reason to go to war, to kill Rhaegar. You know that, ever since the tourney at Harrenhal, when Rhaegar named me Queen of Love and Beauty, his pride was wounded. He was humiliated. He wanted blood after that. My disappearance just gave him the excuse he needed. Her voice broke slightly at the end. And now Rhaegar is dead. Ned went still for a moment, then exhaled sharply, as if the weight of it was pressing down on him from all sides. Ned's voice lowered again, though the anger in it had faded into something far more tired. All those dead men, he said quietly. All those banners called, all those houses broken apart. He looked at her then, and there was something hollow in his eyes. All because you thought running away would make things better. Lyanna covered her face with trembling hands. I never wanted this, she whispered brokenly. Gods, Ned, I never wanted anyone hurt. Ned said nothing at first. He simply stood there looking at her, at his little sister who suddenly seemed far smaller than the girl he remembered riding through Winterfell's courtyards with a sword in her hand and laughter in her voice. When he finally spoke again, the anger was gone. Only grief remained. Wanting it otherwise does not change what happened, he said quietly. Lyanna's shoulders shook as silent sobs overtook her. 56 comments 0 vote. The real talk. The Tower of Joy had never felt like a place meant for happy endings. Its pale stone stood alone amidst the harsh wastes of Dorne, like the weathered bones of some dead giant abandoned beneath the scorching sun. The wind howled endlessly around its ancient walls, carrying dust, heat, and an almost suffocating silence. Even its name felt cruel now. There was no joy left in this place. Only the remnants of promises and choices that had torn kingdoms apart. Merlin stood outside Lyanna Stark's chamber for a long while without moving. Late morning sunlight spilled weakly into the narrow hall behind him, flickering across the stone walls as the voices inside rose and fell in uneven rhythm. At times there was anger. At times grief. And at times silence so heavy it seemed to smother the very air. Most men would have called it a private conversation. Most men would have walked away. Merlin did neither. It was a bad habit he had carried from his previous life. When his mother and father argued, he would linger nearby, listening carefully to make sure his father did not turn violent against her. Over time, it had become instinct for him to stay and listen whenever voices behind closed doors grew sharp. And curiosity had always been one of his worst habits. When Eddard Stark entered the chamber earlier, Merlin had intended to leave. Truly. But then the voices inside had begun to rise, sharp with emotion, and before he realized it, he had remained outside the door listening to the truths buried beneath a year of war, rumors, and lies. And what cruel truths they were. Not because two young people had run away together, but because the choice had dragged an entire realm into war and left countless dead behind it. Had the rebellion never happened, had fathers and sons not burned or bled for it, then perhaps the story would have been remembered very differently. The realm would have embraced the tale already waiting to be written, that Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark had fallen in love. A tragic romance, a beautiful prince trapped in a political marriage falling for a wild northern girl, the two abandoning duty and the world itself for each other. Songs would have been written about them one day. Young girls would have dreamed of a love like theirs. Poets would have turned it into something beautiful, and people would have sympathized with them. But too many graves stood between the truth and a happy story now. Merlin almost scoffed aloud at the thought. Because after hearing Lyanna's broken voice from behind those doors, after hearing the guilt, confusion, and pain buried beneath her words, the matter no longer seemed so simple. It looked far uglier now. Rhaegar Targaryen had not merely been obsessed with prophecy. He had drowned in it. Everything always came back to prophecy with Targaryens. And Lyanna Stark had been little more than a frightened girl caught in the storm of a prince who believed himself chosen by destiny. Merlin leaned slightly against the cold stone wall, arms folded across his chest as the conversation inside finally quieted. Silence settled over the corridor. Then came the sound of approaching footsteps, followed by the slow creak of the chamber door opening. Eddard Stark stepped out first. The Lord of Winterfell looked exhausted, though not in a physical sense. Merlin had seen soldiers tired from battle before. This was different. Ned Stark looked like a man whose entire understanding of the world had just cracked apart beneath his feet. His gray eyes immediately found Merlin standing several feet away beneath the pale sunlight. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then something seemed to dawn on Ned. His expression darkened, and when he finally spoke, his tone was noticeably colder. "How long have you been standing there?" Merlin winced slightly before offering the man an almost innocent smile. "Well," he said lightly, "you and your sister were shouting loudly enough for half the tower to hear. I came looking for you earlier, saw the two of you arguing, and decided not to interrupt." Ned continued to stare at him in silence, and there was unmistakable judgment in that gaze. "So you heard everything," he said at last. Merlin met his gaze calmly. "Yes." For several seconds the Stark Lord simply looked at him. Merlin could almost see the conflict moving behind those gray eyes, shifting restlessly between anger, embarrassment, exhaustion, and distrust. Another man might have reached for his sword, and another lord might have demanded blood for overhearing such secrets, but Eddard Stark was not another man. Honor restrained him even now, and perhaps gratitude did as well, for Merlin had, after all, saved Lyanna's life. Finally Ned released a weary breath. "That was not meant for your ears." Merlin shrugged carelessly. "It hardly matters anymore." Ned rubbed a hand over his face before asking, "What are you doing here?" Merlin's eyes shifted toward the chamber behind him. "I came to speak about the child." Ned frowned immediately. "What about the child?" Merlin glanced toward the room again. His mother should hear this as well. The Stark Lord's patience visibly thinned. "Can it not wait?" "No," Merlin answered simply. "I have already remained here 4 days longer than intended. I must leave soon. There are matters elsewhere that require my attention." After a faint pause he remarked, "And I've tested the limits of boredom in this place enough to consider it an achievement." Ned regarded him silently for a moment before finally stepping aside. Merlin entered the chamber without another word. The room now smelled only of flowers, faint and lingering in the air. The curtains near the bed shifted gently as the desert wind slipped through the narrow windows. Lyanna Stark sat against the pillows exactly where Ned had left her. She looked smaller now, not the wild wolf maiden from stories, nor the girl knights had once named Queen of Love and Beauty, but a young woman held together by sheer will after everything she had endured. Her face was still marked by tears, her eyes red and heavy, but her body no longer showed sickness or weakness. Merlin's potion had already restored her strength. What remained was something harder to heal, the exhaustion that lived in her thoughts, the weight pressing down on her mind and heart. When she looked at Merlin, there was fear in her eyes, not of violence, but of judgment. Her voice came out hoarse and unsteady. "Are you here to kill me?" Merlin blinked in confusion before glancing toward Ned, who suddenly found the stone floor very interesting. Understanding dawned quickly enough. Merlin sighed. "No," he said flatly. "I didn't save you yesterday simply to murder you today, girl." A faint flicker of embarrassment crossed Lyanna's face. Merlin continued casually, "Besides, with your brother standing here, killing you would be rather inconvenient. Especially if swords become involved." Ned gave him a tired look and didn't have the strength to argue that Merlin was not a swordsman, but a sorcerer, and that he could not protect his sister from him at all. Lyanna lowered her gaze slightly. For a few moments silence lingered in the chamber before Merlin spoke again. "We need to leave this place soon." Ned frowned slightly. "And?" Merlin's expression remained calm. "And I will be taking the child with me." The reaction was immediate. Lyanna stiffened, and Ned's entire posture hardened at the same moment. "What?" Lyanna whispered. Merlin looked toward her. "The boy is a Targaryen. He should be raised among his own blood." Fear flashed across her face instantly. "What do you mean you are taking my son?" Merlin answered without hesitation. "What I said," Merlin replied. "I remained in this cursed tower for days because of the child. He belongs somewhere safe, not here, not in the cold, not hidden away. He is a prince, and his life is not safe with those who helped the usurper kill his father and take his claim to the throne." Ned's voice sharpened at once. "You mean I would harm my own nephew?" Merlin met his gaze without hesitation. "In a way, yes. Even if you do not intend it." The room seemed to tighten after that answer, as if even the air had grown reluctant to move. Lyanna shook her head weakly. "No, no, the Kingsguard would never allow that. They were protecting him." Merlin gave a soft hum. "Last night I spoke with Sir Arthur and the others." Ned's eyes narrowed slightly at that. Merlin ignored it. "It wasn't a particularly pleasant conversation," he continued dryly, "especially after I punished them for trying to be stubborn. But they spoke honestly enough afterward." Lyanna stared at him anxiously. Merlin continued. "Rhaegar ordered them that if he did not return, and if complications arose during childbirth, then the child was to survive above all else. Even above the mother. Lyanna went deathly pale as the words sank in, her breath catching as though the very air had turned heavy around her. Ned's jaw tightened at once, the change in him sharp and immediate, his entire expression hardening as he processed what had been said. They were instructed to take the child somewhere safe, Merlin said. Somewhere he could be raised according to Targaryen traditions. No, Lyanna whispered. The word came out broken, as though it had been torn from her rather than spoken, heavy with shock and betrayal. Merlin looked at her steadily. The boy was never meant to remain with you. Silence filled the chamber. Then Ned finally spoke, breaking it with a voice firm and final. The child stays with his mother. Hope flickered desperately across Lyanna's face. Merlin looked at him and then let out a tired sigh. You can't keep the child, Lord Stark, he said. What exactly do you intend to do? Take him and parade him in front of Robert, and say, here, I have your enemy's child with me. Ned's voice rose in immediate protest. No, I will take him to the north and hide his identity forever. No one will ever know who he is. Merlin stared at him for several seconds before slowly shaking his head. Lord Stark, I don't wish to interfere in your family affairs or any other matter. To be honest, it doesn't concern me, he said evenly. I am only speaking for the child. Merlin stepped closer toward the window, glancing briefly toward the endless Dornish sands beyond. Do you truly believe the realm will not discover who he is, no matter how carefully you hide him? The moment you take your sister and that child from this place, the truth will follow. The realm already believes Lyanna Stark was dishonored by Rhaegar Targaryen. Lyanna visibly flinched at the word dishonored. He continued anyway, ignoring her. The child's identity will become obvious sooner or later. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not in a year. But eventually someone will learn the truth. His gaze held steady, and if that happens, the boy will be killed. The honesty of the truth seemed to wound her more deeply than cruelty ever could. Lyanna's voice cut through at once, colder and more defined than before. No, I will protect him. I will never let anything happen to my son, he's a Stark. There was desperation in her voice now. And a prince who has a claim to the throne, and is a threat to the new reign, Merlin finished calmly. Lyanna nodded instinctively. Yes, which is exactly why he will never be safe. Anger flashed through her exhausted expression. You know nothing. Merlin let out a small, almost indifferent breath. I am sorry to break this to you, little girl, but you can't protect him, he said. You are in no position to protect even yourself, let alone a child. Robert will hear of this, and when he does, he will kill the boy. Not out of hatred, perhaps, but out of necessity. Politically, he will see him as a threat to his reign. And that alone will be enough. Ned's eyes narrowed slightly. Robert is an honorable man, he said firmly. Not a child murderer. Merlin almost laughed at that. The man clearly trusted Robert Baratheon far more than reality would ever allow. Robert Baratheon smashed Prince Rhaegar's chest apart with a warhammer because of wounded pride, rage, and obsession. Ned's face hardened. He fought a war believing his betrothed had been kidnapped. Yes, Merlin replied calmly. Because Robert believes your sister was taken against her will. He does not know the truth, that Lyanna Stark left willingly. The room grew quiet again. Merlin continued more seriously now. Do you truly believe Robert Baratheon would peacefully allow Rhaegar's son to grow into manhood? He is not a murderer. No, Merlin asked softly. Ned did not answer, because deep down, even he didn't truly know how Robert would react. Merlin's eyes darkened slightly. What happens when the lords of the realm begin whispering about the child? What happens when some ambitious fool decides to crown him one day? What happens when people begin calling him the true king? Lyanna looked terrified now. He is only a baby, she whispered. And that has never stopped men from killing children before. The words settled heavily in the room. Merlin sighed quietly before continuing. You think Robert is the only danger? He is not. He looked directly at Ned. There are still loyalists scattered across the realm, Merlin said. Targaryen supporters. Men who lost fathers and sons to Robert during the rebellion and now hunger for revenge. Some would try to use the child for their own cause. Others would sooner see him dead before their enemies could claim him. Ned moved beside the bed, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. And he shook his head slowly. I will protect him, he said firmly. No matter what comes, I will hide him from everyone if I must. Even his existence. Merlin stared at him for a moment before releasing a quiet breath through his nose. You can't hide it forever. There are witnesses here who know what happened. They know Lyanna was in labor, and they saw the Kingsguard willing to die protecting her and the child. Eventually, people will begin asking why, and when they do, the child's identity will become known. The answer came too quickly. Ned's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice firm with conviction. They are trusted friends, men loyal to House Stark. My companions will never speak of what happened here to another soul. Merlin looked almost amused. Come now, Stark, you and I both know loyalty is not eternal. Ned's expression hardened further. A drunk man lets something slip one night. A desperate man trades secrets to save himself. A frightened man breaks under pain. And a greedy man will whisper anything for enough gold. Merlin's gaze remained steady. That is how kingdoms truly work. The chamber fell silent once more as Ned sank deeper into his thoughts. Because deep down, he knew Merlin was speaking the truth. Perhaps that was what made it so difficult to hear. He looked toward his sister, saw the desperation in her eyes, the fear of losing her child after losing everything else, and he understood why she clung to hope so fiercely. And the boy, whatever his origin, still carried Stark blood through Lyanna. Ned could not easily condemn him to death for that. Yet he knew the danger was real. In another circumstance, with less emotion clouding his judgment, he might have reached the very same conclusion as Merlin. He would have weighed the risks, thought of the realm, of Robert, of the child's claim, and he would have admitted that sending the boy away was the safer choice. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of it all. He hated the truth, but he still recognized it. Merlin continued calmly. Great houses have destroyed each other over smaller secrets than this one. Lyanna suddenly spoke, her voice raw with panic. I can't do that. Both men turned toward her. Tears gathered in her eyes again as she looked at Merlin, shaking her head faintly in denial, unable to accept what he was saying. I will not let my child be taken away because of fear and rumors and politics. Then she turned desperately toward her brother. Please, Ned. Her voice broke apart completely. Please help me. The sight of her seemed to fracture something in the room, not because she was beautiful or tragic, but because she looked utterly helpless. A frightened young mother begging her brother to save the only thing she had left. Please, she whispered again. Don't let him take my son. Ned stepped closer immediately. I will find a way, he said. I swear it. Merlin rolled his eyes. Oh, for the love of your gods. Ned's head snapped toward him at once, his reaction sharp and immediate. Merlin, by contrast, only lifted a hand in a slow, almost lazy gesture, pointing toward him as if the matter required little effort at all. You are still thinking like a brother, he said calmly. A pause followed, brief but heavy, before his tone sharpened just enough to cut through the room. Start thinking like a lord. The words landed harder than they were spoken, settling into the silence with an uncomfortable weight. Ned's jaw tightened in response, his restraint visible even in the way he held himself still. The North follows House Stark, Merlin continued. Thousands marched beneath your banners. Thousands died believing they fought to rescue your kidnapped sister from a mad prince. His eyes moved toward Lyanna. What happens when they discover the truth? Lyanna looked away immediately. Merlin did not stop. What happens when the North learns their sons and fathers died because Lyanna Stark willingly fled with a married prince? Ned remained silent, because there was no comforting answer. The North is loyal, Merlin admitted. But even loyalty has limits. Men bury sons, women lose husbands, heirs vanish forever into graves because of war. His voice grew colder. And now imagine those same people learning the war began because your sister ran away willingly. Lyanna looked stricken. They will hate me, she whispered faintly. Merlin met her eyes directly. Oh, of course they will, he said flatly. What did you expect them to do, love you for it? The honesty hurt more than cruelty ever could. Ned looked visibly uncomfortable now, but Merlin continued anyway. They pity you now. The realm sees you as a stolen maiden hidden away by a prince obsessed with you in madness. You are a victim in their songs. Then he leaned slightly closer. That illusion is the only thing protecting you. Lyanna's lips trembled. If the truth emerges, Merlin continued quietly, you will not be remembered kindly. He glanced toward Ned, then back to Lyanna, his expression steady and detached. They will not sing tragic songs about love, he said simply. His gaze remained on her. They will call you foolish, selfish, weak. A brief pause followed, his tone unchanged, almost matter of fact. And some will call you a dishonorable woman. Ned's face darkened instantly at the last words, the reaction sharp and instinctive, the kind of anger a brother cannot easily suppress when his sister is spoken of that way by a stranger. But Merlin ignored the glare entirely. "You owe the realm a mountain of corpses, girl." Lyanna flinched like she had been struck. "The child will suffer worst of all." Her hands tightened instinctively against the bed, as if protecting something that had once been there but was no longer in sight. "And what do you think they will call him?" he asked, letting the question hang in the silence. No one answered, so Merlin did, his voice calm and detached, as if stating something already decided. "Bastard, rapeborn, abomination, dragonspawn." Ned finally stepped forward sharply. "That is enough." Merlin looked toward him without emotion. "No, it is not enough, because none of you are thinking clearly." Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Ned's gaze shifted slowly, first toward Lyanna, then away again as if the weight of it had begun to settle into him. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, controlled, but strained at the edges. "I will make sure the realm never learns the truth," he said. "All of it, what truly happened here will stay buried." Merlin's eyes narrowed slightly. "So you are going to hide it," he said. "All of it?" Ned gave a sharp shake of his head. "I will," he said again, more firmly now. "I will hide it, the truth, the mistake that was made." Merlin's expression remained unreadable, but his tone followed without hesitation. "That she willingly left with the prince." The words made something shift in Ned's posture. For a moment, he looked away, eyes closing briefly as if the weight of it pressed too hard against him. When he spoke again, there was conflict in his voice, but also resolve. "I know what it is," he said quietly. "I know what it looks like. It is dishonorable. It goes against everything I believe as a Stark." His jaw tightened. "But she is my sister. And I will not see her destroyed for it." After a brief pause, "I will bury it," he said at last. "All of it. The truth will remain what the realm already believes, that she was taken. That she was the victim." Merlin gave a small nod. "A wise choice, honestly. Your sister remains a victim. Rhaegar remains the villain. The North remains loyal. Robert remains furious at a dead man instead of questioning why the rebellion began in the first place." His eyes shifted toward Lyanna. "But that only works if very few people know what truly happened." Tears rolled silently down her face as the weight of everything settled into the silence. Ned's voice came slowly. "Who knows?" Lyanna looked up at him, uncertain. "What? Who knows you left willingly?" he asked again. Lyanna swallowed, her hands tightening faintly in her lap. "Sir Arthur knows," she said at last, voice barely steady. "And the others? The Kingsguard?" Her gaze dropped. "Perhaps House Dane as well, I don't know." Ned did not react. His face remained unreadable. "And?" he asked. Lyanna hesitated. Then, almost in a whisper, she added, "Solia." Merlin raised an eyebrow slightly at the unfamiliar name but said nothing. Ned spoke at last, his tone careful, almost hopeful despite everything. "If those are the only ones who know," he said quietly, "then perhaps the secret can survive." Then Merlin let out a soft, almost dismissive snort. "Perhaps," he said, "but convincing the Kingsguard to lie may prove difficult. Those men worship honor almost as much as you do." Ned's face darkened slightly. Merlin personally thought the matter solvable. Arthur Dane and the others could be convinced one way or another. But frankly he did not care enough to involve himself deeper in northern family drama. So instead he returned to the actual matter. "The child still comes with me." Lyanna looked at him as if he had spoken madness. "No, 15 comments 0 vote. The real talk too." Merlin let out a tired sigh. "You aren't listening to what was just said," he replied flatly. "But he is my son," she insisted. "I could care less if he is your son," Merlin said coldly. "I will be taking him. And you will remain silent about it." There is nothing more to argue. The certainty in Merlin's voice silenced her instantly. He crouched slightly until his eyes met hers directly. "It is the better choice." Lyanna shook her head repeatedly through tears. "No, no, he lives," Merlin continued. "He grows far from Robert Baratheon and all the hatred waiting for him here." Then he said more quietly. "And he grows without hearing himself called ill-born for the rest of his life." Lyanna looked away sharply. Everyone in Westeros knew the cruelty bastards endured, how they were marked from birth and never fully accepted by the world around them. But children born from rape suffered something worse. They were not only denied legitimacy, but treated as living reminders of broken vows and bloodshed. Their very existence was tied to shame in the eyes of others, spoken of in lowered voices, and remembered as consequences something heinous rather than children. Merlin spoke softly now. Tell the truth and the realm hates you while killing the child. He raised one finger. Hide the truth and the realm pities you while still despising the child. Another pause. Either way his life here becomes misery. Tears continued falling down Lyanna's face silently. He would never be safe in Winterfell, Merlin said. Nor Riverrun, nor the Vale, nor anywhere Robert Baratheon rules. Then he straightened fully. The only real option is taking him far away from the consequences his parents created for him. Ned stared at him carefully now. Where? Merlin shrugged lightly. Dragonstone. That answer changed everything. Ned visibly stiffened. What? To his family. Ned's eyes sharpened at once. What relationship do you have with the Targaryens? He asked. Merlin gave a faint, almost tired smile. That is complicated, he said simply. The answer clearly did not satisfy the Stark Lord. Merlin did not seem concerned. He continued anyway. I am merely ensuring they survive. Ned's gaze lingered on him, studying Merlin's face as though it might reveal something his words refused to give. Lyanna suddenly spoke again, panic returning instantly. No. Both men looked toward her. They will never accept him. Her breathing became uneven again. The queen will hate him. She may punish him or, she swallowed hard, or kill him. Merlin shook his head calmly. You know nothing about Queen Rhaella. She lost everything because of him. She lost everything long before him, Merlin replied quietly. That silenced her. The Targaryens stand on the edge of extinction, Merlin continued. They are not going to murder one of the few surviving children carrying their blood. Still Lyanna shook her head weakly. Fear had consumed her completely now. Then suddenly she turned toward Ned again desperately. Please. Her voice cracked apart entirely. Please don't punish me like this. Ned looked away from her. That hurt her more than anything Merlin had said. I will go to Essos, she rushed out quickly. I will disappear. Tell them I died. Tell them anything you want. I will never return. Just please. Her fingers trembled as she clutched at the edge of the bedsheet. Please don't take him away from me. Ned closed his eyes briefly. Then she whispered once more, please, Ned. But the Lord of Winterfell remained silent. And slowly Lyanna realized the truth. Her brother was beginning to understand Merlin's argument. That realization crushed whatever strength remained inside her. Then suddenly she looked toward Merlin instead. Then I will go with him. Ned's eyes snapped open immediately. No. His voice came sharp as steel. You will return north with me. That is final. Lyanna stared at him in disbelief. Merlin rubbed his forehead tiredly. Unfortunately, I agree with Stark on this matter. She looked at him with betrayed fury. You cannot come with me. Why? Merlin snorted softly. Because I have no desire to wake up one morning and discover Robert Baratheon invading Dragonstone while screaming about rescuing his stolen maiden from an evil sorcerer. Despite everything, Ned almost looked like he wanted to laugh at that. Almost. Lyanna slumped weakly back against the bed. Completely powerless. So this is my punishment, she whispered brokenly. Merlin looked at her for a long moment before sighing. Perhaps he should have felt more sympathy. Perhaps he did, somewhere beneath the annoyance. But pity changed nothing. Listen carefully, he said more gently than before. When matters calm and the realm forgets this madness, I will bring the boy to see you. Lyanna looked up slowly. He deserves to know his real mother. Her expression hardened instantly, resentment rising in her eyes, cold and wounded and bitter, while Merlin accepted it without reaction, as if it were easier to bear than grief itself. Finally he stepped back toward the door. You should spend what time remains with your son. The words shattered her composure again. Ned stood motionless beside the bed, expression unreadable beneath the dim sunlight. Merlin gave Ned a small nod before turning away. Then he walked from the chamber. Behind him, he could hear Lyanna Stark beginning to cry again. After the talk within the chamber had ended, Merlin descended the worn stone steps of the Tower of Joy and stepped into the pale light of the late morning. The air outside was warm and still, carrying only the faint whisper of wind across the red mountains of Dorne. At the foot of the tower sat the three remaining Kingsguard. Esser Arthur Dayne rested against the stone wall with Dawn laid across his knees, silent and watchful. Beside him stood Esser Oswell Went, his white cloak shifting softly in the wind, while Esser Gerald Hightower remained unmoving like an ancient white statue carved from granite itself. They had finally recovered from the effects of Merlin's spell. The previous night had not passed peacefully between them. The moment Esser Oswell had regained enough strength to move, he had attempted to strike Merlin in fury and desperation. The attack had ended before it truly began. Merlin had frozen the night where he stood with a flick of his wand, leaving him trapped beneath the spell once more while the other two Kingsguard watched in grim silence. Only after the magic faded hours later had Esser Oswell been released. None of them attempted such foolishness again. The three knights had agreed to accompany Merlin to Dragonstone. Whatever doubts or suspicions lingered within their hearts, one truth outweighed all others. Prince Rhaegar had commanded them to protect his son, and until their dying breath they intended to obey him. Esser Arthur, however, had argued once more before their departure. The boy would be safer in Starfall, he said quietly as Merlin approached them. My sister would raise him as her own. Ashara can be trusted with his life. Merlin looked at him for a long moment before shaking his head. No, he replied simply. Dragonstone. The answer left little room for argument. Arthur's jaw tightened faintly, but in the end he nodded. Though proud and stubborn, he was not blind. Merlin had already proven that none of them could stop him if he chose otherwise. Afterward Merlin turned his attention to the midwife and the two young women who had assisted Lyanna through the birth. They waited nervously near the tower, wrapped in rough shawls against the late morning breeze. The old midwife bowed her head the moment Merlin approached. My lord. Merlin studied the two girls standing behind her. Both were young, no older than 17 or 18. One possessed chestnut brown hair tied into a loose braid while the other had darker curls and wary eyes that constantly shifted toward the armed knights nearby. I will need someone to nurse and care for the child during the journey, Merlin said. I will not force either of them. The choice is theirs. The old woman immediately stepped forward before the girls could even speak. They will go gladly, my lord. Merlin raised an eyebrow slightly at her eagerness. The old woman clasped her wrinkled hands together. Please take them both. The two girls looked startled by her words. It is better they serve beneath a lord than remain here, the midwife continued with quiet desperation. You know what happens to girls without protection. One day they are sold to some drunken old man for a handful of coins. Another day they vanish into a brothel. Her voice trembled faintly. At least with you they may have a future. Merlin found himself genuinely surprised. The woman barely knew him. She didn't know where he came from, nor what kind of man he truly was, yet she entrusted the lives of her granddaughters to him with almost frightening faith. Or perhaps it was not trust at all. Perhaps desperation simply left people with little choice. Merlin's gaze shifted toward the girls. Fear lingered within their eyes, yet beneath it rested cautious hope. What are your names? He asked. The brown-haired girl lowered her head slightly. Solia, my lord. The darker-haired one followed after a heartbeat. Sula. Merlin nodded once. Very well, you will come with me, and while you remain under my protection, no man will touch you against your will. The relief on the old woman's face was immediate and overwhelming. Tears filled her eyes as she repeatedly thanked him. Merlin said nothing further. In truth, he needed them. A child, especially a newborn, could not be raised by warriors and sorcerers alone. These two young women would become necessary companions in the uncertain life now unfolding before him. Once preparations were complete, Merlin finally returned to the tower one last time. That part proved far more difficult than any battle. Lyanna Stark refused to let go of her son. The chamber echoed with crying and pleading as she clutched the child tightly against her chest, tears streaming endlessly down her pale face. Eddard stood nearby in silence, his expression heavy with grief and helplessness. You cannot take him from me, Lyanna whispered brokenly. Please. Her voice sounded so fragile that even the hardened Kingsguard waiting outside lowered their eyes. But Merlin knew there was no other choice. The boy could not remain here. Robert Baratheon's rebellion had ended in blood, and if the truth of the child's birth ever became known, the infant would spend the rest of his life hunted. Gently but firmly, Merlin took the child from Lyanna's trembling arms. Her cry of anguish cut through the room like a blade. Eddard closed his eyes. For a brief moment Lyanna looked at Merlin with pure hatred and resentment through her tears, as though she would curse his name forever for this wound he inflicted upon her. Yet Merlin endured it in silence. Some burdens could not be avoided. At last he turned toward the doorway with the child wrapped securely in his arms. Eddard walked beside him until they reached the tower entrance. Will I see him again? Ned asked quietly. Merlin paused. One day, he answered. If fate allows it. The Stark Lord gave a slow nod, though sorrow remained etched deeply across his face. Outside, the noontime sun had begun to rise over the mountains. Merlin mounted his demon while the others prepared themselves for the long journey ahead. The infant remained calm within his cloak, unaware of the war, grief, and bloodshed surrounding his birth. Behind them, Lyanna's sobs still echoed faintly from the tower. With 5 companions riding beside him, Merlin turned toward the distant lands of the Will where a ship awaited to carry them across the sea to Dragonstone. And so they departed the Tower of Joy at last, riding out toward Will. Later, as they traveled on horseback, Merlin would remember how he had only learned the child's name after taking him from Lyanna's arms. She had hesitated before whispering it, as though even speaking it made it feel more final, more unbearable, before reluctantly letting the boy go. He could still recall the moment clearly, the way he had looked down at the child afterward, something faintly thoughtful in his expression as he repeated the name under his breath. 28 comments 0 vote. A happy welcome. 8 days had passed since Merlin and the 3 Kingsguard had departed from the lonely port of Will along the coast of Dorne. 8 long days upon the narrow sea, beneath cold winds and restless skies, with salt spray crashing against the ship and the constant cries of a child too young to understand any of it. The journey itself had been calm, far calmer than Merlin had expected. He had spent the first days anticipating some sort of attack against their ship at any moment. But no pirate sails appeared upon the horizon. No storms battered their vessel. No sellswords or raiders crossed their path. The war had ended only recently, yet already the narrow sea seemed quieter than before, as though the realm itself had grown weary of bloodshed. Robert Baratheon had won, and now his allies were moving to stabilize the realm for his rule. After a long year of fighting, the 7 kingdoms rested in that strange silence that follows war, a silence where thousands still mourned their dead while lords smiled at one another across halls and tables, already sharpening new knives for the feasts and politics of a new king's reign. The ship cut steadily through dark blue waters beneath gray skies as Dragonstone slowly emerged from the sea before them. Merlin stood near the bow of the vessel with his cloak stirring softly behind him. His silver eyes remained fixed upon the distant island fortress rising from the sea like some ancient beast of black stone. Even from afar, Dragonstone looked unnatural. Beside him stood Esser Gerald Hightower, the previous Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The old knight rested both gauntleted hands upon the pommel of his sword as he stared toward the island in grim silence. Behind them, Esser Arthur Dane and Esser Oswell Went stood near the mast speaking quietly amongst themselves while the 2 young women who had accompanied the child remained seated near a covered corner of the deck. Solia held the infant carefully against her chest while Sula sat beside her, gently rocking the child whenever he cried. The boy cried often during the journey, his wails echoing across the ship during long nights upon the narrow sea. Yet no one complained. Even the hardened Kingsguard softened whenever the child began crying. To them, he was one of the last living reminders of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the man they had once believed would become their king. The war had taken him from them, and so the child had become something precious in his absence. Merlin stood watching Dragonstone, his eyes narrowing toward the island in the distance. Something feels wrong here, he thought. Very wrong. The feeling had only grown stronger over the last 2 days. When he had first sailed from Dragonstone weeks ago, the waters surrounding the island had been crowded with patrol ships of the royal fleet. War galleys bearing the 3-headed dragon had constantly sailed around the island like watchful wolves guarding their den. But now, he saw nothing. Not a single patrol ship. Not a single war galley. Only emptiness surrounding the island. That absence unsettled him far more than open battle ever could. Esser Gerald finally spoke. Dragonstone held 300 loyal soldiers when you departed, did it not? Merlin nodded slowly. That is what Esser Willem Darry told me before I left. The garrison remained loyal to Queen Rhaella and the royal fleet was stationed here as well. The old knight frowned deeply. Then where are they? Merlin remained silent to his question. Gerald gestured toward the waters ahead. The port is nearly empty. There should be patrol vessels surrounding the island. We should have encountered at least one warship before approaching the harbor. Esser Arthur Dane stepped beside them and studied the distant fortress in silence for a moment. There is no smoke or fire, he murmured, his voice was low. And no sign of enemy ships that might have taken the island. No sign of battle at all. Perhaps the queen departed, Merlin said quietly. Perhaps she sailed elsewhere after facing unknown circumstances. Esser Arthur shook his head. There is nowhere safer than Dragonstone for the remaining Targaryens. His blue eyes hardened. If something happened here. He did not finish the sentence. None of them wished to voice the thought aloud. The ship continued forward. Hours later, the harbor finally came into full view. And Merlin's unease only deepened when he looked toward the docks. They were almost deserted. Only a few fishing boats and small transport vessels sat quietly beside the piers, unmoving in the still water. No royal banners flew from the towers above the harbor. No soldiers marched along the walls or patrolled the docks below. The entire port felt abandoned. As the ship finally docked, the sailors hurried to secure ropes while wooden planks were lowered onto the pier. Merlin descended first. The three Kingsguard followed immediately behind him, every one of them tense despite their calm expressions. Solia and Sula came last, clutching the child protectively as they stepped carefully onto Dragonstone soil for the first time. The smell of salt and faint smoke met them as the wind rose, carrying across the sea like an unseen welcome from the island itself as they approached Dragonstone. A group of soldiers approached quickly from the harbor. The moment they recognized the white cloaks of the Kingsguard, they bowed deeply. "It is an honor, Esser Gerald. Esser Arthur Dane." Esser Oswell went. Esser Gerald Hightower stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the soldiers ahead. "Why is the harbor empty?" he demanded. "Where are the patrol ships? Why are the waters undefended? Is this how the knights are protecting the queen and the royal family?" The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances at his questions, unsure how to respond and lacking the authority to answer a knight of his standing. When Esser Gerald Hightower saw that the men still did not answer, he clicked his tongue in clear dissatisfaction. "Tisk, useless men," he said coldly. "Then tell me this at least, who is in charge here?" One finally answered. "Esser Ormond commands the garrison now, my lord." Esser Gerald gave a disgusted scoff. "That weasel." Merlin glanced toward him. "You know him, I know his kind," Gerald replied coldly. "Ambitious men with weak blood and weaker honor." Then he turned back toward the soldiers. "Take us to the castle." The soldiers obeyed immediately. As they began ascending the long stone stairs leading toward Dragonstone, Merlin quietly motioned for Solia and Sula to remain close behind him. The two girls walked on in a quiet daze, their eyes moving over everything in stunned awe. Dragonstone was unlike anything they had ever seen. Massive dragon statues loomed over the pathways. Black towers rose into the sky like jagged spears. Steam escaped from cracks in the volcanic rock beneath their feet. Yet despite the fortress's grandeur, something about the atmosphere felt wrong, as though an unsettling quiet had settled over the place, leaving it strangely empty. And Merlin noticed something else. As they ascended toward the fortress, more soldiers appeared, falling in behind them as they moved. It was not the behavior of an escort. It felt more like being watched than being guided, as though they were captives rather than one of them. His hand slipped quietly into his sleeve until his fingers wrapped around the smooth wood of his wand. Just in case. They continued climbing. Finally the enormous gates of Dragonstone opened before them. And the moment they stepped into the courtyard, everything changed. Dozens of soldiers surrounded them instantly. Archers lined the walls above with arrows already drawn. Spearmen and swordsmen blocked every exit across the courtyard floor. Steel pointed directly toward them. The Kingsguard reacted immediately. 3 swords hissed from their scabbards in the same instant. Esser Gerald stepped forward furiously. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice thundered across the courtyard. "How dare you point weapons at the Kingsguard?" The soldiers didn't lower their weapons. Instead, a large armored knight slowly emerged from amongst them with an amused grin upon his face. "Come on, lads," the knight said mockingly. "Don't frighten our honored guests." His eyes moved across the white cloaks. Well, the man said, his tone carrying a faint edge of amusement. "What do we have here?" "Esser Arthur Dane, Esser Oswell Went, Esser Gerald Hightower." The knight laughed softly. "The famous heroes with their fancy nicknames finally arrive," he said, "after the war is already lost." At the welcome, Merlin let out a quiet sigh and muttered under his breath, "Ah, here comes the villainous monologue." The knight's head snapped toward him at once. "What did you say, you whore's son?" he demanded. Merlin only offered a calm, almost pleasant smile. "Oh, nothing," he replied lightly. "I was just admiring your armor. It looks very good on you." The knight glanced down at himself, the anger easing for a brief moment. "You really think so?" Merlin gave a small, polite nod. Esser Oswell Went narrowed his eyes at their exchange and spoke in an authoritative tone. "Identify yourself." The knight turned to him, a smirk forming on his lips. "Of course you don't know me. Small knights are rarely remembered by great men like you." He gave a mocking bow. "Esser Malian Morn, a humble knight of humble birth." His grin widened. "My father was knighted years ago by Esser Gerald himself." Esser Gerald looked utterly unimpressed. Merlin stepped slightly forward. "Where is Queen Rhaella?" he asked calmly. Mallion's eyes shifted toward him, his expression souring with clear disdain. "The queen is occupied," he said flatly. "Then what of Sir Willem Darry?" came the reply. "He cannot be too busy as well, can he?" "Occupied, Sir Ormond?" Merlin asked once more. At that, the knight's smile widened slightly. "He is busy," he said. "Very busy indeed." Merlin's expression remained calm, though inwardly his suspicions solidified. Something had happened here. Behind him, Sir Arthur whispered quietly. "Did you bring us into a trap, sorcerer?" Merlin rolled his eyes slightly. "If I intended to kill you, Sir Arthur, I could have done it in Dorne. I would not have needed to bring you along and endure 8 days of travel from Dorne to Dragonstone just to kill you here." The knight grimaced reluctantly. Merlin lowered his voice further. "There is something wrong here." Sir Oswell spoke without moving his gaze from the soldiers. "There are too many archers. We are essentially at their mercy now." "Yes," Merlin murmured. "Can you protect us?" Arthur asked quietly. "I mean, can you do that weird sorcery of yours and get us out of this situation?" Merlin's fingers tightened around his wand. "Oh yes." Then he glanced subtly toward the corridor leading deeper into the castle. "But not out here." The arrows worried him. Even magic could not always react faster than dozens of arrows loosed at once. Behind Merlin, Solia and Sula looked utterly terrified. Solia held the infant so tightly that the child had begun crying softly again. Merlin turned slightly and smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, girls," he said gently. "Everything is fine. It's just a welcome ceremony for us." As he spoke, he gave them a quick wink. The girls nodded shakily despite clearly not believing him. Merlin raised both hands slowly. "We surrender." The Kingsguard looked toward him sharply, their attention narrowing as they studied his actions, trying to decipher what he was planning. Then, after several tense moments, they reluctantly lowered their swords onto the stone ground. Mallion laughed loudly. "Well now," he said. "The mighty Kingsguard surrendering to me. Ha, I can already hear the songs they will sing of me after I capture the heroes of their stories." He looked positively delighted. "Take them to the dungeons. Our guests must be tired. As good hosts, we should show them proper hospitality." The soldiers immediately moved closer. As they were surrounded and escorted toward the inner halls of Dragonstone, Merlin leaned slightly toward Sir Arthur. "When it begins," he whispered quietly, "protect the girls and the prince first." Sir Arthur gave a single nod. They entered the long volcanic corridors of Dragonstone, their footsteps echoing faintly against the black stone walls. Torches burned in iron brackets overhead, their flames swaying in the cold draft that moved through the ancient castle. Above them, the archers stationed upon the walls could no longer see into the passageways. Perfect, Merlin thought. 6 armed soldiers marched ahead while several more followed behind them with spears raised cautiously. Merlin walked calmly between them, his expression almost bored, one hand hidden beneath his cloak. The guards were tense now. They had seen the 3 Kingsguard follow him up in surrender. Rumors of a sorcerer had already spread through the fortress, so many of the men had heard of him, or at least heard of what he had done when he was here a month ago. Now they watched him closely. Men shifted uneasily around him, tightening their grip on their weapons as though steel alone could offer them any real protection. Merlin quietly slipped his wand from within his sleeve. Then he moved, murmuring a soft spell under his breath. Defindo. A cutting charm flashed invisibly through the narrow corridor. For half a heartbeat, nothing happened except Merlin's quiet recasting of the spell. Then blood sprayed across the black stone. A soldier screamed as his hand fell to the floor, still clutching his spear. Another collapsed instantly when a deep crimson line opened across his thigh, the flesh splitting to the bone. One man stared in horror at the ruined stump of his arm before he began shrieking loud enough for the sound to echo through the halls. Panic spread immediately. What in the 7 hells? What is happening? The rear guards stumbled backward in terror, smashing into one another as they tried to raise shields and spears against an enemy they could barely understand. Merlin turned smoothly. "Close your eyes," he told the girls calmly. Then he raised the wand again. Another cutting charm crossed the corridor. A soldier's throat opened instantly. The man dropped his sword and collapsed to his knees, choking upon blood before falling face first onto the stone. At the same moment Merlin flicked his wand toward another guard. Stupefy. The stunning spell struck the man square in the chest. The force of it was monstrous. The soldier was hurled backward as though struck by a charging horse. His body smashed through the corridor entrance, flew into the outer courtyard, and crashed against the stone ground several yards away with a sickening sound. Chaos erupted. The king's guard moved immediately. Sir Arthur Dane seized a fallen sword before the nearest soldier could recover from his shock. The sword flashed once in the torchlight and a man's helm split cleanly apart. Sir Gerald Hightower tore a spear from another guard's hands and drove the butt of it into the man's face hard enough to break teeth and bone alike. Steel rang through the corridor. Men shouted in fear. But Merlin moved through it all almost effortlessly. There was no strain upon his face. No desperation. He walked through the slaughter with calm measured steps, his wand rising and falling with smooth precision. A spell flashed. A soldier's breastplate burst inward as he was thrown violently against the wall hard enough to crack the stone behind him. Another spell. A man screamed as an invisible force lifted him from the ground and hurled him bodily down the staircase, his neck snapping upon the steps below. The surviving guards broke almost immediately. Some tried to flee deeper into the castle. Others simply froze. None of them understood what they were facing. Merlin stepped out into Dragonstone's outer courtyard. The cold sea wind struck his cloak instantly. Dozens of soldiers turned toward him from across the yard. For a moment everything went still. Then shouting exploded across the battlements. "Kill him, archers, loose!" But they were too slow. Merlin's wand moved faster than their commands. Spells crossed the courtyard one after another in brilliant flashes of light. The first archer had barely drawn his bow before a cutting charm sliced through his chest. The man toppled backward over the battlements, his scream vanishing abruptly as his body disappeared into the crashing waters below the island cliffs. Another soldier was struck by a stunning spell so powerful that it launched him completely off his feet. He flew backward into two other men, all three smashing through the stone railing together before plunging screaming into the sea far beneath Dragonstone. Panic spread across the walls. Men stumbled away from him in terror. Some dropped their weapons entirely. Others tried desperately to hide behind shields, but it made no difference. Merlin's spells tore through wood and steel alike. Blood sprayed across the black volcanic stone while armored bodies crashed lifelessly upon the ground. One knight charged him with a roar, sword raised high. Merlin didn't even step aside. With a lazy flick of the wand the knight was lifted violently into the air and hurled across the courtyard. The man struck a wall with enough force to shatter stone before collapsing in a broken heap. The horses near the stables screamed and reared in terror from the noise and flashes of magic. Archers upon the walls attempted another volley. They never released it. Spells struck among them mercilessly. Men were thrown from the battlements one after another, their bodies vanishing over the edge of Dragonstone to smash against the rocks or disappear into the dark waters below. One archer lost his footing while trying to retreat and fell screaming from the wall entirely. The surviving soldiers finally broke formation completely. Fear consumed them. These were hardened men of Dragonstone, soldiers who had survived war and storm alike, yet now they fled from a single man dressed in dark robes with no armor and no blade. Because this was not a battle they understood. Knights could be fought. Armies could be fought, but this was something else entirely. Merlin walked forward through the courtyard calmly as spells continued to flash from his wand with terrifying precision. Every movement was smooth, controlled, almost effortless. Within minutes the fighting was over. The courtyard fell silent save for the groans of wounded men, the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below, and the frightened cries of horses. Blood covered the black stone of Dragonstone. Bodies lay scattered across the yard and beneath the walls. Far below the battlements, the sea swallowed the dead. Merlin exhaled quietly and lowered his wand. Then he turned and walked back inside as though nothing remarkable had happened. The Kingsguard had already secured the corridor. Sir Gerald was dueling Sir Malian more near the entrance while Sir Arthur and Sir Oswell shielded the girls and the child behind them. Merlin glanced outside. "I cleared the yard." All three knights stared at him. "All of them?" Arthur asked. Merlin shrugged lightly. "Yes." Even Sir Arthur Dane, the legendary sword of the morning, looked unsettled now as he watched Merlin's wand in hand. There was something unnerving about it, something that did not belong in any familiar form of warfare, especially when wielded by a man who could cut down dozens of soldiers with what looked like nothing more than a simple stick. Solia and Sula were shaking badly now. Merlin crouched slightly before them. "Are you hurt?" They shook their heads immediately. "Good," Merlin said softly. "Then everything is fine." Neither girl looked convinced. Behind him, Sir Gerald finally disarmed Malian and forced the wounded knight to his knees with a sword against his throat. Merlin approached calmly. "Don't kill him yet." Gerald stepped aside. Merlin looked down at the bloodied knight. "What happened here?" Malian spat blood onto the floor. So you are the sorcerer Sir Ormond warned us about, he said more quietly now, the edge of confidence gone. How foolish I was not to take his warning seriously. I should have listened when he told us to be careful of you. Merlin ignored the comment. Where is Queen Rhaella? The knight laughed weakly. Go to hell. Merlin's expression hardened slightly. A flick of his wand. The man screamed as blood poured from his ruined eyes. The corridor echoed with agony. The Kingsguard themselves looked disturbed. Merlin stepped past the screaming knight. You three protect the prince. Then he walked deeper into Dragonstone alone. The castle felt dead silent. When Merlin had last been here, servants had filled the halls. Guards had patrolled every corridor. Maids, cooks, stableboys, and messengers had moved constantly throughout the fortress. Now there was nothing. No laughter from those who once lived in the fortress, no voices echoing through its halls, only silence settling over everything like an abandoned fortress. Merlin's unease deepened with every step took. He encountered scattered soldiers throughout the halls. None survived long against his wand. Some died instantly, while others were thrown back and frozen against the walls by magic before they could even scream. Floor after floor he climbed. And all the while, one terrible thought lingered in his mind. What if he was too late? He had already altered fate greatly. Lyanna Stark lived, the Kingsguard lived, and Elia and her children were alive after he had rescued them. He had left Dragonstone believing nothing further would happen there, relying on what he knew from his past life, where the queen had been safe until her labor months later. But it seemed things had changed. Others who should have died had survived because of him. Perhaps fate had merely claimed different victims in exchange. If Queen Rhaella or Elia Martell were dead because of his interference. Merlin's jaw tightened. That thought angered him more than he expected. Finally he reached the upper floors where the royal family had resided before his departure. And there he found them. Dozens of armed soldiers guarded the royal chambers. More than before. Merlin stopped at the far end of the hallway. The soldiers had not noticed him yet. He slowly exhaled. At least they were likely alive. Otherwise there would be no reason for such heavy guard. But now came the not-so-difficult part. Merlin looked at the armed men standing before the doors. Then his grip tightened around his wand. And he quietly prepared himself for yet another massacre. 45 comments 0 vote. Cleaning. Merlin stepped into the corridor leading to the royal chambers. The hallway was lined with dozens of soldiers stationed at precise intervals, yet their discipline seemed to end there. Some leaned against the walls, talking quietly among themselves. Others laughed softly or drank from small flasks. Merlin frowned. The casual atmosphere felt deeply wrong amid the grim tension of the fortress. He stepped deeper into the corridor, his boots clicking softly on the stone. A small, mischievous smile tugged at his lips. He raised a hand in casual greeting and called out in a cheerful voice. Well, lads. I must commend you on your diligence. Truly exemplary work holding this corridor. I'm half tempted to tell Sir Ormond he should give you all a raise, maybe even a few extra coins for such outstanding service. The effect was immediate. Heads snapped toward him, eyes narrowed, hands drifted to sword hilts as an uneasy silence swallowed the corridor. One soldier, bolder than the rest, stepped forward, his voice tight with suspicion. Who are you? How the hell did you get in here? No one enters this section unless Sir Malian himself escorts them. Before Merlin could respond, another voice cut through the tense air, trembling with both fear and recognition. It's him, the sorcerer they spoke of. A soldier shouted, awe and terror mingling in his words. Merlin turned his gaze to the young man, raising an eyebrow with a hint of mock admiration. Ah, you have a sharp mind. Recognition comes naturally, it seems. I was beginning to worry that my absence might have made you forget my handsome face. Surely a few weeks haven't dulled your memory so quickly. The soldiers stiffened, their earlier bravado fading as Merlin's eyes swept over them. His smile grew, cold and sharp. You've been watching, huh? He said, his tone casual, almost conversational. Good, but not quite enough. Didn't you hear what happened below? The chaos, the screams. Your friends, gone. Some crying for mothers who couldn't answer. Quick, brutal, finished before they even knew it. He stepped closer, eyes flicking over them like a predator assessing prey. And here you are, still standing where you shouldn't. Careless. Lucky, maybe, but lucky only lasts so long. I'm afraid I'll have to fix that. He let out a soft, almost regretful sigh, his tone deceptively casual. You see, it pains me, truly, that I have to kill you all, he said, his voice smooth but carrying a weight that made their skin crawl. If you hadn't made the mistake you did, I wouldn't be here. You were useful once, soldiers meant to protect, meant to serve. But now, he shook his head slowly, mock disappointment in his eyes. Now I see no use in you. You betrayed those you were meant to protect. Tisk, 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 such a waste. Such a waste. With a smooth and deliberate motion, he drew his wand. The soldiers faltered, raising their shields in nervous haste, unsure what this strange sorcerer, someone they had only heard rumors of, intended to do with the slender stick pointed at them. Merlin's voice cut through the tension, which was calm and precise, as he cast the spell. Stupefy. A soldier charged toward him, sword raised with grim determination, only to be hurled backward, crashing against the wall near the chambers with a sickening impact. Blood poured from his mouth as he crumpled to the floor, wheezing and groaning. Another soldier threw a spear, but Merlin moved with fluid precision, ducking effortlessly as the weapon sailed past harmlessly. Merlin's voice fell again, calm and commanding. Defendo. The spell struck the spear-wielding soldier mid-charge, cutting through his chest with brutal precision. Blood spurted from the wound as the man collapsed, lifeless. A group of soldiers rushed forward, swords and shields raised, trying to coordinate an attack, but Merlin moved with unerring control. Spells of shifting colors and fierce intensity danced through the corridor, striking the men in their path. Some were hurled backward, others frozen mid-motion, and still more fell to their knees, drained of strength by the sheer force of the enchantments. Within moments, the corridor was littered with bodies, the floor dark with blood, shields shattered and abandoned. Merlin looked down at the carnage before him, his expression unreadable. His voice was low, almost a murmur to himself. Damn, with only basic spells, this much havoc, one can only imagine the destruction if greater spells were unleashed. This world grows more interesting with every obstacle. Shaking his head slightly, he continued toward the chambers, stepping over pools of blood and bodies without hesitation. At the entrance of one chamber, he paused, wand at the ready, sensing any ambush that might await. Slowly, he pushed the door open, revealing a smaller room filled with captives. Men and women looked up, some startled, others whispering in alarm. A few peered toward the door as though piecing together the source of the earlier commotion. Recognition sparked in some eyes, and a few faces lit with hope upon seeing him. Merlin gave a small, reassuring smile. "It's good to see you all," he said. "I was worried this castle was empty, except for the soldiers who, well, let's just say their hospitality isn't exactly impressive. I didn't see anyone and thought maybe no one was left." An older woman, urgency etched into her features, stepped forward. "My lord, please help the queen. Her life is in danger," she pleaded. Merlin's expression hardened slightly, the gravity of the situation sharpening his focus. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. "She is held here, on this floor, with her child," the woman replied, glancing past him at the bodies of the soldiers strewn across the corridor. Her voice trembled as the full realization of Merlin's actions registered. "My lord, they are all dead." Merlin nodded. "All those who stood in the way are no longer a concern. We are safe from them." He turned his gaze toward the remaining captives. "Are there any other soldiers hidden elsewhere in the castle?" An older man stepped forward hesitantly. "Not that we know of, my lord. We have been confined here for 4 days. The dungeons may hold loyalists, but I cannot say for certain." Merlin's lips pressed into a thin line as he looked around the corridor. He turned to the nearby men, simple servants and workers of the fortress, and spoke quietly, without any harshness. "Help me with these men," he said. "Move their bodies out of the corridor. It's not right for them to lie here like this." A few men volunteered, nodding eagerly. Merlin allowed himself a small smile at their initiative before moving on. Ahead, a door drew his attention. Unlike the others, it was ornate, carved with intricate designs that gave it an air of importance. He approached and pushed it open, revealing a long chamber filled with lavish furnishings and rich tapestries. Inside, Queen Rhaella Targaryen stood protectively in front of a small figure, her eyes wide at his sudden arrival. Merlin's gaze softened, a flicker of relief crossing his face as he recognized her. Beside her, Prince Viserys peered out cautiously, clearly uneasy but alert. "Merlin," the queen breathed, her shoulders sagging with visible relief. "I did not expect you back so soon." A faint, weary smile touched her lips. "A month with no word, I feared you had left us for good, despite your promise to return with help." Merlin noticed how the queen spoke to him now, her tone a little more excited and familiar than before. It was not as distant or formal as when they had first met. I faced complications in Dorne, Merlin replied, calm but carrying a quiet energy. They delayed my return, and by the time I was able to come here, much had already happened in my absence. Yes, the Queen murmured, her voice tense with the weight of recent events. Many unpleasant things have happened. Merlin inclined his head slightly, his tone calm but firm. It is all under control now. Any threats have been taken care of. Prince Viserys stepped forward, his small frame trembling slightly but his voice earnest. Merlin, he said, a mixture of fear and trust in his tone, so many terrible things happened here. They hurt us, they must be punished. Merlin's gaze fell upon the boy, and he could not miss the bruises marring his young face, evidence of the blows he had endured. The child had clearly suffered, yet there was a spark of defiance lingering in his eyes. Merlin gave a slight nod toward him, his voice soft and reassuring. Don't worry about them, I have taken care of those who posed a threat. Well, those I have faced, at least. He turned back to Queen Rhaella, his expression turning steady. I must go and find Princess Elia and her children. The Queen's steps quickened, her presence close behind him. I will go with you. It has been days since I last saw them. Merlin shook his head gently, his tone persuasive. Your Grace, it would be safer for you to remain here. The corridor ahead is unpleasant for anyone not prepared for it. For a moment, she paused, but then she walked past him and stood by the chamber's door, her eyes scanning the corridor. Her gaze fell upon the servants who were gathering the bodies of the fallen soldiers, carefully moving them to the side to clear a path. Some had been wounded, some already lifeless from Merlin's swift work, yet the Queen's face remained composed. She observed the blood staining the stone floor, the scattered remains of men who had once blocked their path, and then turned her eyes back to Merlin with a calm, unwavering expression. You need not worry about that, she said, her voice quiet but steady. And don't consider me a simple lady, naive to the brutality of the world. I have seen men and women burned alive, their screams still echoing in my ears. I have faced horrors far worse than this. You need not protect me from it. Merlin raised his eyebrows, a trace of admiration mingled with his usual guardedness. You are right, he admitted softly, a wry note in his voice. My thoughts were perhaps naive. He straightened, focusing on the task at hand. Where, then, might Princess Elia and her children be held? They are in the corridor upstairs, the Queen replied, her voice was calm but certain. Merlin nodded. Without hesitation, he moved past her, and she followed closely behind, her steps measured and purposeful. As they advanced down the corridor, the Queen's eyes lingered on the servants, now actively clearing the remains of the soldiers. The men paused at her presence, bowing respectfully, and she returned their gesture with the same composed calm, checking on them briefly to ensure they were unharmed. Their ascent up the stairs was steady, though the tension in the air was palpable. Merlin's instincts prickled, the familiar sense of impending danger urging him forward. As they reached the upper corridor, the attack came suddenly, violent and unexpected. Merlin reacted instantly. A soldier lunged toward him, weapon raised, but Merlin's reflexes were faster than thought. With a flick of his wand and the precise chant of a spell, the attacker froze mid-motion, suspended as though time itself had halted around him. Without hesitation, Merlin stepped past, guiding the immobilized man toward an open window. A firm push sent the soldier tumbling over the edge of the fortress, disappearing into the shadows against the walls below. The Queen's gaze followed the motion, her eyes briefly flicking to the wand in Merlin's hand. There was a fleeting, unreadable emotion in her expression, something different, almost calculating, that she did not reveal. Merlin, however, remained oblivious to the silent judgments and decisions forming behind her calm exterior, his focus unwavering as he led her onward. The corridor narrowed as they moved on, and Merlin's eyes flicked over a small side passage branching off to the left. 2 or 3 chamber doors lined it, each one holding the possibility of safety or something far worse. The Queen followed quietly behind him, saying nothing, her presence steady as she kept pace. Her gaze kept drifting to the wand in his hand, as if she were trying to understand it, or the man who carried it so easily. Each step brought them closer to Princess Elia and her children, yet the air grew heavier with every passing moment, charged with quiet anticipation. Merlin moved ahead with careful precision, alert for anything that might come next. As Merlin entered the corridor, Queen Rhaella followed quietly behind him, as if her life were not in danger. They reached a door at the far end, but before Merlin could get to it, harsh voices carried from within. Shut it, You whore! Shut your mouth, or I will cut your head off myself. One of the men bellowed. The heavy breathing of the men inside mingled with the frightened voices of those they held captive. Merlin's jaw tightened. He gestured subtly to the queen to stay back, her eyes narrowing with understanding. Without hesitation, he kicked the door open, the wooden panels splintering slightly as the room was revealed in its grim tableau. Inside, 2 soldiers stood over their captives. One held a dagger pressed sharply against the throat of Mary, Princess Elia's lady-in-waiting, while the other pointed a sword toward Elia herself. The princess crouched in the corner, her children clinging to her, her gaze fixed on the soldier with hatred burning in her eyes. Before the men could react to Merlin's arrival, his wand was already raised. With a sharp, commanding motion, he muttered the immobilizing spell, and the 2 soldiers froze mid-motion, their eyes wide in silent shock. Merlin stepped further into the room, scanning quickly for any hidden threats. Finding none, he moved toward Elia, whose eyes widened as she recognized him. Relief swept across her face, and she spoke with uncontained excitement. "Sir Merlin, you finally returned." Merlin allowed himself a small smile. "Yes, though I arrived only moments ago. It seems I am often greeted in ways that are less than friendly. This is the second time I've had such a welcome coming here." His gaze shifted to the children. They were unnervingly calm, as though moments like this had become a part of their reality. The queen moved past him with measured steps, her voice soft but filled with concern. "Are you all right? Did they harm you in any way?" Elia gave a small, reassuring smile. "No, Your Grace. They were guarding us at first, but when they heard the noise from below, they attempted to take us hostage." Merlin's eyes fell upon the soldier still frozen behind Mary, the dagger pressed against her neck. The lady-in-waiting's voice trembled slightly as she addressed him. "Would you be so kind, Sir Merlin, as to remove this dagger? I cannot move it myself." "Of course," Merlin replied calmly. With a gentle push, he moved the soldier aside, releasing Mary. She sighed in relief and glanced at Elia to ensure the princess was unharmed. "Please," Merlin said softly to the women, "go outside. I will take care of these men." The queen nodded, her expression steady. She gathered Prince Aegon into her arms and motioned for Elia to follow. The princess rose, casting Merlin one last grateful glance before stepping past him. Merlin returned her smile, watching as they moved safely down the corridor. Once the captives were clear, Merlin turned back to the frozen soldiers. Raising his wand with a calm, measured air, he muttered the incantation for a cutting spell. The blades of magic traced precise lines, severing the throats of the immobilized men. Blood spilled across the floor, pooling beneath them, but neither soldier moved, neither resisted. They were gone, leaving no further threat. After dealing with the 2 soldiers, Merlin exited the chamber and moved to check the remaining rooms, making sure no one was hiding or trying to escape. When he finished, he paused at the threshold of the lower corridor, eyes sweeping carefully. Finding nothing, he made his way down the stairs. At the bottom, he found the 3 Kingsguard already there, having reached the floor where the royal family was staying. The moment Sir Oswald saw him, his voice was urgent. "Is the queen all right? And the princes and princesses?" Merlin inclined his head slightly, his voice calm but carrying a faint edge of mockery. "Everyone here is safe now, the queen, Princess Elia and her children, even Prince Viserys. But that does not mean they no longer need protection. Go on, do your duty as Kingsguard and keep them safe." He scanned their faces, expecting some response, some sign of acknowledgement, but they remained unreadable. A flicker of disappointment crossed his features and he let out a soft sigh. "Well, anyway," he muttered, "there are still soldiers being held in the dungeons and there may be threats there as well. One of you will come with me. The other 2 can remain here to protect the royal family." Sir Arthur stepped forward without hesitation and fell into step beside him as the other 2 Kingsguard moved toward the queen's chambers. Merlin turned to the young girls, Solia and Sula, who clutched the infant prince. His voice was soft and calm, carrying quiet authority. "Go on and follow the 2 Kingsguard to the queen's chamber. Stay there, I will return soon." Both girls nodded, obedience etched into their expressions, and followed the knights down the corridor. Merlin led the way down the staircase to the lower floors of the fortress. The air grew cooler and damper with each step, and the stone walls echoed faintly with every footfall. Sir Arthur, walking closely behind, broke the silence. "So, what was the situation upstairs?" "Dozens of soldiers," Merlin replied nonchalantly, "stationed outside the chambers. Fortunately, They didn't harm the royal family. Why they refrained, I cannot say. Only Prince Viserys bears bruises on his face, the others are unharmed. But we may learn more from those held in the dungeons. The descent was long, the corridors silent except for the faint dripping of water echoing through the empty halls. At last, they reached the heavy door that marked the entrance to the dungeons. Merlin pushed it open, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel. The air was thick and stale, and shadows clung to every corner. He muttered, "Lumos," and a soft, steady light shone from the tip of his wand, cutting through the darkness. A foul stench hit him almost immediately, making him press a hand over his nose and mouth. "What a horrible smell," he murmured. "It's as if I am walking through the streets of King's Landing. Did they not clean these dungeons?" Sir Arthur rolled his eyes, his voice dry. "This is a place for prisoners, not royalty. Unpleasantness is part of the punishment. Comfort has no place here." Merlin sighed, though he could not suppress a small frown. Still, some level of cleaning would not hurt. The tunnel opened into a long hall lined with ironbarred cells. Behind the bars, dozens of soldiers looked up at them. 2 guards stood outside the cells, and Merlin wasted no time. With a precise incantation, he immobilized them, freezing them in place. One soldier, battered and bloodied, caught his attention immediately. Merlin's eyes narrowed in recognition. Sir Willem Darry. Bandages covered his hands and face, evidence of recent, brutal beatings. Merlin's voice, light but mocking, broke the tense silence. "Good to see you, Sir Willem. I never thought we'd meet again under these circumstances. It seems the 7 have been kinder to me than to you. Your prayers must have worked well for me, sailing safely from Dragonstone to Dorne. Perhaps next time, you should pray a little harder for yourself. I'm sure your gods will listen if they can spare a moment for their devoted followers." Willem's face twisted, surprise giving way to scorn. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his tone sharp. "This is no time for jest, sorcerer. The fortress is in danger. We must evacuate Dragonstone immediately." Merlin nodded. "First, we secure the prisoners. Duties and oaths can wait." Willem's eyes flicked to Sir Arthur. "And the Queen, Princess Elia, are they safe?" "They are," Arthur assured him calmly. "All are unharmed." Recognition softened Willem's features. "Sir Arthur Dane," he said, a note of reverence in his voice. "It is an honor to see you again." Arthur inclined his head. "You have suffered much." Willem smiled faintly, the hint of pride returning. "Any hardship is worth it for our oaths and duties." Merlin raised a hand, cutting off further discussion. "We will discuss oaths later. Right now, we open these cells." Arthur glanced at Willem. "What happened here? Where is Esser Ormond? Did he?" Willem's face darkened, his tone laced with venom. "That bastard betrayed us. He is the cause of all this." Merlin inserted the keys he had taken from the fallen soldiers into the cell locks, releasing them one by one. The soldiers emerged, blinking and stretching after their confinement, helping each other from the other cells as they moved toward freedom. "Well, your vacation is over, lads," Merlin said, his tone brisk. "Move out toward the gates. Patrol the fortress. Be vigilant. Protect this place." Many looked to him, then to Willem. Willem raised a hand decisively. "I will stay," he said. Merlin shook his head. "No, appoint someone else. I need to speak with you first about what happened here." Willem looked around and chose a middle-aged knight. "You go. Inspect the fortress. Lock the doors, guard the entrances. Allow no one in or out." The knight nodded and barked rapid orders to the dozen or more soldiers now freed, sending them out to carry out their instructions with precision. 3-3 comments 0 vote. A small council. The chamber of the painted table buzzed with a quiet tension that seemed to settle in the very stones of Dragonstone. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, brushing the banners of House Targaryen and catching the painted surface of the great table at the room's center. The queen sat rigidly in her chair, every line of her posture regal, though a flicker of unease betrayed the mask of composure she wore. Beside her, Princess Elia's hands rested folded in her lap, her face controlled but pale and strained beneath the surface. Merlin stood a few paces away, his eyes narrowing as he took in the people gathered in the chamber. It could almost be called a council, though the atmosphere was far from orderly. 3 Kingsguard, Esser Gerald Hightower, Esser Oswell Went, and Esser Arthur Dane, stood at attention, while others shifted in their seats or remained silent, lost in thought. The tension was thick, almost tangible. Everyone seemed caught up in their own concerns, their gazes darting to different corners of the room, as if each person were weighing their own fears and plans. Merlin let out a slow sigh, his voice quiet as he spoke. So you are saying that Esser Ormond, the head of the garrison, has been in contact with someone in King's Landing, and that all this time he has been plotting to betray the Targaryens and hand them over to the new king. When Merlin finished speaking, the room reacted in different ways. Some groaned, others let out quiet sighs, and a few simply stared at him with bored expressions. Esser Gerald, as always blunt and unflinching, scoffed and said, "Of course. Something like that could be expected from him. He has always been a man who buries his head in places that serve him best. Wherever there is opportunity, there is Esser Ormond, always calculating and scheming." Merlin's eyes darkened with frustration. Then why was he ever placed here if he was known to be like this? Dragonstone is not just any fortress. It is the ancestral seat of the Targaryens, the traditional seat of the heir to the Iron Throne. Loyalty here is meant to be absolute. How could someone like him be trusted as commander of the garrison in a place so vital? Esser Oswell-Went's voice cut in, cold and measured, leaving no room for argument. He earned the king's favor. When the king asked how he should be rewarded, Ormond requested this position. The king, in his usual generosity or perhaps his blindness, granted it. Merlin shook his head and asked curiously, turning his gaze to the queen and Princess Elia. "Then tell me this, if Ormond took the fleet to King's Landing, why leave her grace, Princess Elia, her children, and Prince Viserys here under the protection of his own men? Why not bring them directly to Robert as a sign of surrender?" The silence that followed hung heavy over the room, tense and suffocating, until it was finally broken by Esser Willem Darry, still wrapped in bandages from a recent skirmish, who spoke with bitter clarity. "That snake came to me before he left. He offered me a share in his treachery. If we handed over her grace and the children to the usurper, both he and I would be rewarded with positions in Robert's Kingsguard. When I refused and tried to arrest him for treason, the soldiers turned against me. Ormond seized the fortress, locked up those loyal to us, and killed anyone who resisted. That is why he broke his oath and why Dragonstone ended up in this state." Merlin nodded slowly, his mind turning over the implications. It was worse than he had feared, yet it was unsurprising. The politics of loyalty were often as poisonous as the swords wielded in battle. Queen Rhaella spoke, her voice calm yet clear. The quiet authority in it silenced the room and pulled every counselor's gaze to her. "Ormond came to my chambers a few times," she began. "The first time, he tried to convince me to marry him. He said he would protect me at all costs. I, of course, refused." All eyes widened in surprise at her words, but she continued steadily. "The last time he came, he was clearly dissatisfied. He told me of the contacts he had made. One was with someone in King's Landing who promised him a high position, what now seems to be a place among Robert's Kingsguard. The other was willing to offer him vast sums of dragon gold to hand me and Rhaenys over, and perhaps even the boys. That is why we were left here, I believe. He was weighing his options, testing the promises of gold against the favor he might curry in the south." A scornful snort escaped Esser Gerald. "And who, I wonder, would be foolish or wicked enough to put a price on the lives of the royal family?" Elia spoke for the first time, her voice was soft but precise. "There are many in Essos who value Targaryens above coin. The last dragonlords, even without dragons, hold blood that can be used. Sorcerers sacrifice blood to achieve power, and the blood of a dragon is priceless." Merlin felt every eye in the chamber turn toward him, questioning, seeking the confirmation they dared not speak aloud. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Don't look at me, I don't involve myself in such rituals. Blood sacrifices and their ilk are abhorrent to my philosophy. My power, such as it is, follows other laws." The Kingsguard maintained their scrutiny. They had seen him work, seen the power he wielded, and yet their questions were inevitable. Merlin met their gaze evenly. "Ormond desires the favor of a king, perhaps even two. He brought the fleet to Robert as tribute, hoping the usurper will meet him in kind. If he fails, the wealthy individual in Essos will provide the alternative. It seems that Ormond is a man who covers every angle, and he will not fail to see all possibilities." Esser Gerald exhaled, a long, resigned sound. "He will make deals with both, I fear. The princes may go to King Robert, while her grace and Princess Rhaenys could be delivered to the wealth of Essos. He doesn't care, so long as his own prospects are ensured." Esser Willem looked around at the others, his expression serious. "It doesn't matter what Ormond was planning. His whole scheme only mattered if we weren't rescued. Now that we are, his plans are useless. He didn't count on the arrival of the sorcerer or the three Kingsguard, so everything he set in motion no longer works. What we need to focus on is far more urgent. Ormond has delivered the fleets to the usurper. That man now commands hundreds of ships, enough to bring armies straight to Dragonstone. If they arrive, the castle could fall immediately. Your Grace, the children, their safety is the most important thing. I suggest sending you somewhere safe, perhaps Bravos. I have been there in my youth. It is secure. There you could gather support, train forces, and remain out of reach of these rebels. Queen Rhaella's expression stiffened, her voice firm and unwavering. Absolutely not. Dragonstone is our home. The Targaryens have lived here for centuries. The moment we leave, the realm will crumble. Houses loyal to us will see our flight as weakness and give in to the Kinslayer. I will not go into exile, and I will not let our legacy be lost. As long as I live, I will not abandon this place. I refuse to be remembered as the queen who surrendered everything for fear. Esser Willem spoke up, as he was careful but firm in his tone. With respect, Your Grace, sometimes prudence means thinking ahead. Staying here without support invites disaster. Striking back from afar, once forces are ready, is strategy, not cowardice. Esser Gerald's sharp and unyielding voice cut through the conversation. And what then? Shall the Targaryens become enemies of all Westeros? Should we bring foreign armies across the narrow sea, buy sellswords to reclaim the throne? History would never forgive it. The realm would unite against us, regardless of our cause. Were it that simple, the Blackfyre line would not have vanished decades ago. Queen Rhaella's eyes gleamed, the determination in her voice was unwavering. I will not abandon Dragonstone. This fortress has housed my family for over 400 years. It is second only to Valyria in the history of our house. If we leave, we abandon everything, the symbols, the legacy, and the hope of the realm. Dragonstone is ours. It will remain ours. The Kinslayer will not take it. Merlin's shoulders slumped in a quiet sigh, acknowledging the impossibility of defending the island under normal circumstances. We have no army, no fleet to protect the waters. Dragonstone is vulnerable, completely vulnerable to attack. Esser Oswell spoke, his voice calm and measured, though a grim note of optimism threaded through it. 32 men remain loyal. That is enough to hold the fortress for months, even without succumbing to siege. But the island itself cannot be truly protected from outside assault. Esser Willem added cautiously, provided we have enough food, perhaps a year or two can be endured. The walls will hold. Supplies are the only limitation. Esser Gerald's gaze flicked toward Merlin. We have a sorcerer in our midst who could cut down dozens of men alone. If he remains, Dragonstone can endure far longer than mere mortals would allow. Food may be arranged, there is always a solution. Merlin inclined his head in acknowledgement of the praise, though the thought of being confined to a fortress for months did not appeal to him. I can help, but I cannot remain indefinitely. I have other matters to attend to. The queen's eyes narrowed, curiosity piqued. Other matters? What could demand your attention beyond Dragonstone? Matters of magic, perhaps. Merlin nodded, partially, but there are other things. Some truths beyond the wall, matters that may affect all Westeros. I cannot ignore them. Nevertheless, I can stay long enough to protect this fortress, to defend your family. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the queen's lips, a small relief she allowed herself in the presence of trusted guardians. Elia, too, visibly relaxed, her tension easing slightly at the knowledge of Merlin's protection. Queen Rhaella's soft and deliberate voice broke the silence. I have yet to ask, who is the child you brought with the two girls? Silence fell again, heavier than before. Merlin exchanged a quick glance with the Kingsguard knights, who stood rigid at the queen's question. Finally, Esser Arthur spoke, his voice carrying a faint trace of nervousness. Your Grace, the child is a Targaryen. The chamber went still, every eye fixed on Merlin and Esser Arthur as though waiting for the revelation to bloom. Explain, the queen commanded, her tone was sharp but controlled. Esser Arthur drew a steadying breath. He is Prince Rhaegar's child, Your Grace. We were ordered to protect him at all costs. That is why we couldn't accompany Prince Rhaegar into the Battle of the Trident. Queen Rhaella's eyes widened slightly, shock rippling across her otherwise serene features. Elia's hands clenched tightly in her lap, the only visible sign of her discomfort and disbelief. As the mother, the northern girl? The queen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Esser Arthur's nod was immediate and resolute. Yes, Your Grace, Lyanna Stark. He is her son, and we were sworn to safeguard him, no matter the cost. Another long silence filled the chamber, heavy with the gravity of what had been revealed. Finally, the queen spoke, her voice calm and steady, tinged with both hope and solemnity. "And what name did she give him?" Merlin stepped forward. "She wished to call him Aegon, but I reminded her that we already have a prince of that name. She chose Baelor, in memory of Baelor I Targaryen, Baelor the Blessed, and Baelor Breakspear. May he grow to honor these great Targaryens of our past," said Queen Rhaella. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, a rare light breaking through her usual solemnity. Even Elia allowed herself a faint smile, and one by one, the others in the chamber nodded, quietly sharing a moment of hope despite the trials that surrounded them. To be continued.